Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight begins our peaceful journey through the great philosophers, a three-part series exploring the minds that shaped human thought from ancient Athens to modern Europe. In Part 1, we'll softly explore the ancient wisdom of Socrates and Marcus Aurelius from the questioning streets of classical Athens to the meditative tent of a Roman emperor, all while discovering how their timeless insights continue to guide us today. Before you drift away into peaceful sleep, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which ancient philosopher speaks to your soul, and subscribe to keep these soothing tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from ancient Greece and Rome lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Socrates, later known as the father of Western philosophy, entered this world between 470 and 468 BC in the peaceful village of Alope, a quiet suburb nestled just beyond the southeastern walls of the magnificent city-state of Athens. Despite becoming one of the undisputed intellectual founders of Western civilization and among the most consequential philosophers in human history, surprisingly few biographical details about Socrates survive in the historical record. What we do know with certainty is that his father, Socrates, earned his living as either a stonemason or sculptor, crafting works from marble and stone, while his mother, Phanerete, served their community as a skilled midwife, helping bring new life into the world during those tender moments of birth. At first glance, these occupations might suggest that Socrates emerged from humble, working-class origins. However, closer examination reveals a different picture entirely. As one of Athens' most renowned public educators, Socrates almost certainly received an elite education during his formative years. Furthermore, his intimate friendships and professional relationships connected him with some of Athens' wealthiest, most prominent, and influential citizens throughout his life. Connections that would have been highly improbable for someone from genuinely humble circumstances. Even during the early flowering of Athenian democracy, this apparent contradiction illustrates one of the primary challenges facing modern scholars who attempt to reconstruct the historical Socrates. The task proves endlessly difficult and frustrating because of the relative scarcity of reliable source material. Perhaps the greatest barrier to our understanding lies in the fact that Socrates himself left behind no written works whatsoever. Everything we know about this towering figure comes exclusively from what other ancient scholars, chroniclers, and historians chose to record about him. Some of these sources carry greater credibility than others, though virtually none can be considered conclusively authoritative by modern historical standards. Most historians tend to place greater confidence in the biographical details that appear in dialogues written by Plato and Xenophon, primarily because both men were direct pupils and personal friends of Socrates himself. Their memories of the great philosopher would have remained relatively fresh when they composed works such as Plato's Apology and Crito, or Xenophon's Memorabilia, published roughly 10 to 20 years following Socrates' death. Logic suggests that if the biographical accounts presented by Plato and Xenophon had diverged dramatically from what Athenians actually remembered about Socrates' conduct, his teachings, or the circumstances surrounding his trial and execution, critical rebuttals would likely have appeared in the contemporary, literary, and historical record. Therefore, Plato and Xenophon may represent our most accurate window into the historical Socrates. Compared to other sources written many decades or even centuries later by ancient scholars including Aristotle, Diogenes, Laertius, and Plutarch. Nevertheless, even the accounts provided by Plato and Xenophon should be read with appropriate skepticism regarding their complete accuracy in depicting or quoting Socrates. Both writers harbor deep reverence for their beloved teacher and mentor, and their admiration for Socrates' wit and wisdom shines clearly throughout their texts. However, both authors may have shaped Socrates' words and actions to serve their own rhetorical or literary purposes. This practice was not necessarily undertaken with malicious or fraudulent intent. Historical scholarship reveals that ancient writers commonly honored important figures by crediting them with heroic deeds or admirable ideas, or even by composing works under their names. Many writers placed their own words into the mouths of more famous, respected, or beloved figures to lend legitimacy to their personal theories and ideas. Practice many scholars believe both Plato and Xenophon employed in some of their dialogues. About Socrates, with these considerations in mind, attempting to reconstruct the historical Socrates might seem like an exercise in futility, since none of the surviving sources meet modern standards of reliability. Yet this uncertainty has not deterred historians from pursuing the challenge. Numerous writers and researchers throughout the past 2.5 millennia have continued, despite these obstacles, to seek a clearer picture of this enigmatic figure. Very little can be definitively stated about Socrates' early life and adolescence. However, historians have attempted to reconstruct a plausible picture using the few details available in the Socratic literary canon, combined with our historical knowledge about the typical experiences of boys and men in classical Athens during the 5th century BC. The village of Alope, where Socrates drew his first breath, housed approximately 3,000 residents. Roughly 1/3 of these inhabitants held Athenian citizenship, a privilege restricted exclusively to freeborn Athenian males. The remaining population, including enslaved persons, women, children, and foreign residents, remained ineligible for citizenship regardless of their contributions to society. The documented experiences from Socrates' later life strongly indicate that he possessed Athenian citizenship himself. This citizenship likely meant that his father, Sophroniscus, also held citizen status. As a skilled tradesman, Sophroniscus probably did not come from particularly affluent or aristocratic stock. However, the relatively privileged youth that his son Socrates apparently enjoyed suggests that Sophroniscus achieved considerable financial success in his profession and gained respectable social standing within their community. Sos counted highly influential and wealthy Athenians among his personal friends, including Lycurgus, son of the distinguished Athenian statesman Aristides the Just. If Sophroniscus indeed worked as a stonemason or sculptor, he was probably not a common laborer or lowly artisan, but perhaps operated as the foreman of his own workshop or quarry, managing other craftsmen and significant projects. Descriptions of Socrates' mother suggest that she possessed superior birth compared to Sophroniscus, another factor pointing toward her husband's professional and social advancement. We know even less about Phanerit than about Sophroniscus. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates referred to her as a Maya or midwife, though scholars debate whether this reference was meant literally or metaphorically. Some scholars wonder whether Socrates spoke metaphorically, referring instead to nurturing or matronly qualities in his mother's character. Married Athenian women, even those from elevated social positions, shouldered numerous domestic responsibilities, suggesting that such women might have possessed limited time to dedicate themselves to pursuing professional occupations outside the home. However, according to research examining ancient inscriptions, the majority of professional midwives identified in classical Greece were freeborn women of respectable, if not elevated, social status. Such women even published medical texts and delivered public lectures in their areas of expertise, making it entirely possible that Phanerit practiced as a legitimate midwife at various points throughout her life. No organized public education system existed in Athens during Socrates' childhood. He would have learned reading and writing at home under the guidance of a private tutor, most likely an enslaved non-Athenian Greek or other foreigner captured during military campaigns. Virtually all Athenian families of middle class or upper class status owned at least several enslaved persons, and some of these individuals were specifically tasked with educating the family's children until age 12, teaching them primarily literacy, numeracy, and perhaps basic arithmetic. The male children of freeborn and prosperous Athenians during the 5th century BC appeared to enjoy considerable freedom and intellectual stimulation, while they were expected to remain silent and respectful in adult company. Boys nonetheless frequently accompanied their fathers into public spaces and adult forums. Young Socrates likely attended theatrical productions, religious festivals, athletic competitions, informal public debates, and even sophisticated banquets at the homes of family friends, always at his father's side. Athenian culture placed marked emphasis on physical health and leisure activities. So games, sports, and exercise were highly valued and actively encouraged for boys of all ages. Athenian boys learned swimming and wrestling techniques. They played games of chance against one another, using knucklebones, much like modern dice games. These activities built both physical strength and strategic thinking skills that would serve them throughout their lives. By age 12, Athenian boys from middle to high social status typically began attending formal lessons in gymnastics and music. Training at the gymnasia was emphasized as necessary not only for personal health and development, but also to build strength and fitness among young, up-and-coming male citizens who would eventually be required to serve in Athens' military forces. Music studies in classical Athens encompassed far more comprehensive subject matter than they do in modern times. Musical education involved not only learning to play instruments such as the lyre, flute, or aloes, a double reed pipe, but also included intensive study of dance and poetry under the tutelage of renowned masters like the famed music teacher Lampos. Young Socrates learned to play the lyre during these formative tastes. Years' lessons he would resume again in middle age when the musician Canus began instructing him in newer, more innovative playing techniques that had been developed since his youth. During his adolescent years, Socrates received training in singing and dancing, and learned to memorize and recite poetry by masters including Pindar, Sappho, Anacreon, and other celebrated lyric poets. As we can observe, music studies encompassed not only musical performance and dance, but also literature, since much lyric poetry was traditionally set to music and performed as integrated artistic presentations. Interestingly, musical education in classical Athens provided substantial historical study and religious education in addition to instruction in the artistic disciplines of music and dance. This comprehensive approach existed because the poets were not merely artists, but often served as historians and documentarians of the legends surrounding the gods, while music and dance played instrumental roles in classical Greek religious ceremonies and rites. This period of musical and gymnastic education in young Socrates' life probably lasted between 2 and 4 years. It is also possible that Socrates began apprenticing in his father's trade sometime during his teenage years or early 20s. Athenian law required fathers to secure professional livelihoods for their sons by the time they reached adulthood, and it was fairly common practice for boys to pursue the same professions their fathers had mastered. Socrates may have spent any number of months or years working as a mason or sculptor in his father's workshop. However, even if he did pursue this trade, it may not have been something demanded of him by necessity, but rather something he chose to keep himself busy and physically fit until he came of age and qualified for mandatory military service in. Obligation demanded of every young Athenian male citizen during Socrates' era. In 454 BC, when Socrates was approximately 15 years old, the Athenian assembly voted to relocate the treasury of the Delian League from the island of Delos to Athens itself, supposedly to protect these vast funds from potential incursions by the Persians, whom the Greek member states of the Delian League had collectively defeated just a few decades earlier. While this immense war chest, filled with gold and silver contributions, had been established for the mutual benefit and defense of all League member states who contributed to it annually, the rulers of Athens, particularly Pericles and the assembly, evidently decided that honoring the original purpose was more suggestion than requirement. This decision marked the beginning of a series of developments that would eventually lead to the outbreak of the devastating Peloponnesian War, which would consume the Greek world for decades. Pericles used the Delian treasury to benefit and beautify the city of Athens, which still bore visible scars from the Persian invasion of previous decades. He embarked on an ambitious building program that included impressive public edifices and spaces designed to showcase Athenian power and culture. The crowning glory of this magnificent revitalization project was the breathtaking Parthenon, an exquisite temple constructed from gleaming white marble and erected atop the Acropolis, housing a magnificent ivory and gold statue of the goddess Athena within its sacred sanctuary. Undoubtedly, the masons, sculptors, and other stoneworkers throughout Athens, quite possibly including Socrates' father Sophronescus, received numerous lucrative commissions and benefited handsomely from Pericles' extensive building program. However, the Delian League soon began to fracture and break down as member states grew increasingly outraged that their annual tributes, or originally intended for the collective defense of all, seemed to be simply enriching the city of Athens while providing little benefit to the contributors. Pericles soon began launching military actions against these so-called rogue states, who refused to continue paying tribute to what had essentially become an Athenian empire, rather than functioning as a member state in a confederacy of equals. Athens increasingly conducted itself like an imperialist power, and other Greek states, such as Sparta and Corinth, began mobilizing against Athens and her remaining allies. By the time Socrates reached adulthood, Athens would desperately need every available citizen soldier, prepared to face a series of armed conflicts that would continue intermittently for more than 30 years. In the meantime, Socrates continued, completing his education and intellectual development. At some point during his mid to late teenage years, the philosopher Anaxagoras became a tutor and mentor to the young Socrates. Anaxagoras had studied under the natural philosopher Anaximander, who was among the first thinkers to attribute the workings of the cosmos to natural rather than divine phenomena and explanations. Having carefully examined a fallen meteorite, Anaxagoras theorized that the sun was actually a fiery rock rather than the god Helios, as traditional Greek religion maintained. He further proposed, correctly, as later scientific investigation would prove, that moonlight was merely reflected sunlight rather than an independent source of illumination. He similarly sought to explain phenomena such as volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and rainbows as arising from natural processes rather than expressions of divine wrath or benevolence from the gods. In his travel journal, a contemporary scholar named Ion of Chios reported that in 451 BC, Socrates visited the island of Samos, accompanied by his tutor Anaxagoras. It seems likely that Anaxagoras wanted to introduce his promising young pupil to another of his own teachers, the fellow natural philosopher Melissus of Samos, who had made significant contributions to early scientific thinking. This journey represents one of the very few instances in Socrates' life when historical sources record him leaving his beloved home city-state of Athens. The trip may have been comparable to a modern post-graduation educational tour, designed to broaden the young man's intellectual horizons. In Plato's Apology, Socrates speaks about the fascination he held during his youth for studying the natural world and its phenomena. However, he eventually came to view the emerging field of natural science as less useful and less relevant to society than other philosophical pursuits and concerns that focused more directly on human behavior and ethics. Having mentors and teachers like Anaxagoras undoubtedly helped awaken and foster in Socrates an empirical bent of mind and a commitment to rational inquiry, which would prove crucial to the later development of his own distinctive philosophical framework and methodology. At the beginning of the Greek New Year, after Socrates reached 18 years of age, he would have presented himself before the Council of his Demos, where he would formally attain his citizenship and independence as an adult member of Athenian society. He would have become eligible to claim any property or wealth held in trust for him, eligible to submit for election by lot to public offices such as magistrate or justice of the peace, and eligible to attend and vote in the Athenian assembly. At this stage in his life, an Athenian citizen was largely free to pursue whatever professional and personal path he chose. However, in Pericles' Athens, the growing need for a robust military force meant that most young men and citizens of Socrates age were called upon for military training and service. The fact that Socrates appears to have become a career soldier for much of his adult life also attests to his family's comparatively high social status. The expense of outfitting a hoplite soldier for military service would have been nearly unattainable for a working-class Athenian, who probably earned no more than 1 drachma per day, if that much. The complete panoply of weapons and armor required for a hoplite warrior could cost several hundred drachmas to acquire and maintain, a substantial investment that required significant family resources, unless a father handed down his own military equipment to his son. New recruits in Athens typically began their military training with tours of duty around the Attica Peninsula, where they might patrol outlying villages and guard the Athenian frontier while engaging in regular training exercises and drills, while learning military skills and building discipline as a unit. This method of training allowed recruits to gain knowledge and experience while keeping them relatively close to home and in comparatively safe circumstances. Historical sources do not report whether Socrates fought in the Battle of Chaeronea, which marked the first major conflict of the devastating Peloponnesian War. He would have been approximately 22 years old at the time, precisely the age most likely to be called up for military service. In the literature of the Socratic canon, Socrates is explicitly mentioned as fighting in only 2 particular battles, the Battle of Patadia and the Battle of Dilium. However, these 2 significant military engagements are spaced apart by more than a decade of active warfare. So it would be reasonable to assume that Socrates spent a substantial portion of his adult life serving as a career soldier. Socrates was 38 years old when the 3-year campaign at Patadia began, and he was 46 when the Battle of Dilium occurred. Athenian troops were rarely required to serve for such extended periods, especially at such an advanced age by ancient standards, which might suggest that Socrates served voluntarily in these campaigns rather than under compulsion. If he indeed served throughout such a lengthy time span voluntarily and continued military service well into middle age, it would be reasonable to assume that he had spent much of his younger life during his 20s and early 30s, becoming an experienced and seasoned soldier. The image of Socrates as a warrior poet is probably not one that many students encountering him for the first time would expect, considering his more famous reputation in history as the barefooted, shabbily dressed, witty, and good-humored elderly intellectual who wandered the streets of Athens engaging in philosophical discussions. However, Socrates appears to have possessed an impressive martial reputation on ancient battlefields. Interestingly, the name Socrates translates to safe in strength, which proved remarkably prophetic. His tolerance for discomfort, pain, and extreme temperatures was frequently remarked upon by his fellow troops and friends. He was said to have marched barefoot and without complaint through ice and snow, wearing little more than a light cloak to cover his armor and provide minimal warmth. At the Battle of Patagia in 432 BC, Socrates performed a daring rescue of his young protege, Alcibiades, who had foolishly broken ranks and charged across the battlefield in pursuit of fleeing Corinthian forces. When Alcibiades impetuously charged forward alone, he did so without support, and the rest of his hoplite unit quickly closed up the gap their comrade had left behind, as they had been trained to do for tactical effectiveness. Not one member of his unit followed Alcibiades forward, which was tactically sound decision-making, since breaking ranks in this fashion was ill-advised and could potentially result in a soldier facing serious consequences from his superiors. The shield of each soldier in the hoplite formation helped guard the body of the man positioned next to him and enhance the overall strength and effectiveness of the line against enemy attack. Breaking ranks put one's fellow troops in immediate and serious danger. When Socrates witnessed his young friend fall wounded before a reformed onslaught by the Corinthian forces, he made the dangerous decision to break ranks himself. He rushed across the chaotic battlefield, navigating through the deadly confusion of men hacking each other with bronze weapons until he reached the fallen Alcibiades. Carefully and gently, he lifted the young man and carried him, along with his fallen armor and weapons, off the battlefield to safety. consistent with Socrates' lifelong reputation for eschewing ambitions for personal glory, fame, or advancement. Plato recorded that Socrates insisted that Alcibiades, not himself, should receive official decoration for bravery in the engagement. One historian has suggested that perhaps Socrates also avoided the public recognition because he had, in fact, endangered his own unit by abandoning his position to save his young friend's life. Like the image of Socrates as a warrior, the picture of him as a strong, daring, physically capable, and well-built young man sits somewhat incongruously with our typical image of him as elderly, bearded, and portly with a receding hairline. As he appears in surviving portraits and sculptural busts from antiquity, contemporaries of the older Socrates, even his close friends, described him as famously ugly as short, balding man with a protruding belly, a broad snub nose, thick lips, and pale, widely spaced eyes that appeared to bulge from his face. However, during the first bloom of youth as a career soldier, Socrates probably presented a very different appearance. Years of intensive gymnastics and military training, combined with possibly slinging heavy stones in his father's workshop, would have given him a straight and well-developed physique. His natural shortness would have appeared as stockiness and solid strength rather than weakness. He might even have been considered handsome, with his widely spaced eyes, broad nose, and full lips situated in a younger face and combined with what was likely an excellent physical condition. One is tempted to imagine someone resembling a young Marlon Brando in terms of physical presence and appeal, although several biographers have attempted to explore Socrates' romantic life and relationships. We actually know very little about his personal or emotional experiences, though this lack of information has certainly not prevented historians from engaging in extensive speculation and theorizing about these aspects of his life. One recent biographical study suggests that as a young man, Socrates might have fallen in love with a renowned intellectual Aspasia, who was herself a philosopher and the de facto wife of the great statesman Pericles. The textual evidence supporting this theory is admittedly rather thin and requires accepting that a female figure named Diotima, whom Socrates mentions in Plato's Symposium as having been his instructress in all matters concerning love, was actually Aspasia herself. The author of this theory points out that only one other woman appears in any of Plato's 30 dialogues as instructing male contemporaries, including Socrates himself, and that woman is Aspasia. In Plato's Menexenos, she is depicted as leading philosophical discussions specifically about the nature of love and relationships. While some historians might find this textual evidence somewhat speculative, the circumstantial evidence proves more interesting and perhaps slightly more compelling when examined carefully. Sometime during his mid-30s or early 40s, Socrates became a tutor and mentor to the young Alcibiades, the same young man he had rescued from the battlefield in 432 BC. Alcibiades was, in fact, the ward of Pericles himself, who had become the boy's guardian following the death of his friend Cleinias, Alcibiades' father, several years earlier. It remains unclear whether Socrates took Alcibiades under his wing before or after the Battle of Patadia. But Plato records that the two men were assigned as tentmates and messmates throughout the military campaign. Alcibiades was not only Pericles' ward, but also a relation of Aspasia through marriage, probably about the same age as Socrates. Aspasia had arrived in Athens during the early to mid-450s BC, at which time her sister was married to Alcibiades the Elder, who was the grandfather of the younger Alcibiades whom Socrates mentored. Aspasia lived in Athens for approximately 2 years before settling into a relationship with Pericles, who was twice her age, and bore him a son, Pericles the Younger. During her early years in Athens, Aspasia quickly developed a reputation for her impressive education, intelligence, aristocratic bearing, and beauty. Her banquets and symposia attracted some of Athens' most prominent citizens and thinkers, quite possibly including Socrates himself, if Plato's accounts are accurate. With all these connections in mind, It becomes increasingly difficult to believe that Socrates did not move in the same social circles as both Pericles and Aspasia during their most influential years. Yet, if they were indeed friends, or at least social contemporaries, why does Plato appear so sparing in his references to Aspasia? Why is Pericles, who at some point entrusted his ward and the son of his old friend to the care and mentorship of Socrates, mentioned only once in any surviving Socratic writings as having known or interacted with the famous philosopher, a branch of Pericles' extended family? The Alcmeonidae even originated from the same village as Socrates. Xanthippe, whom Socrates married during his later years, is believed by some scholars to have been Pericles' cousin, adding yet another potential family connection. Considering all of these documented connections and relationships, one is tempted to view the virtual absence of both Pericles and Aspasia from the works of Plato and Xenophon as quite deliberate. Perhaps this omission had more to do with the widespread unpopularity that Pericles suffered during his later years, or the public hostility and resentment directed toward Aspasia, who was labeled by many Athenians as a corrupting influence on their great leader. Perhaps neither Plato nor Xenophon wanted their beloved teacher, Socrates, tainted by association with these controversial figures who had fallen from public favor. Then again, a romantic relationship between Socrates and Aspasia during their early 20s, before she entered into a relationship with Pericles, might help explain why there are so many apparent connections between the three individuals, but almost no recorded interactions between them in the surviving Socratic literature. While much of this analysis remains largely speculative, it nonetheless represents fascinating new scholarship that deserves consideration and further investigation by those interested in understanding the complex social networks of classical Athens. What can be stated with significantly greater certainty is that Socrates was married twice during his lifetime. His first wife was named Mito, daughter of his father's wealthy friend Lysimachus and granddaughter of the renowned statesman Aristides the Just. Socrates reportedly refused to accept a dowry from Mito's father, another factor that argues for his elevated social status, since it likely suggests he did not require additional financial support. Very little specific information is known about Mito herself, but she was likely considerably younger than Socrates. Plato records that when Socrates died at 70 years of age, he had 2 sons approaching manhood. This suggests that Socrates' eldest son was born when the philosopher was in his late 40s or early 50s, implying that Mito was probably at least a decade younger than her husband, possibly even more. Mito and Socrates had 2 sons together, Menexenos and Sophroniscus, the latter named after Socrates' father. At some point during his 50s, Socrates took a young woman named Xanthippe into his household, initially as his mistress. When his first wife Mito died, Socrates married Xanthippe, and they had a son named Lamprocles, who was apparently still a child of indeterminate age when Socrates was executed in 399 BC. The details surrounding Socrates' marriages remain somewhat unclear, and different ancient accounts suggest various arrangements. Some sources indicate that Socrates may have been married exclusively to Xanthippe during the periods between his military tours of duty and extended months or years on campaign. During the intervals between his military service and the months or years spent on various campaigns, Socrates pursued his ongoing study and development of philosophy in his beloved Athens. Socrates famously refused to accept money from the students he taught, distinguishing himself from the sophists who charged fees for their instruction. Some historians believe that Socrates inherited several rental properties from which he derived a steady income, and he would also have received salary and pension payments for his extensive military service. This financial independence puts something of a dent in his traditional reputation as the impoverished intellectual who chose wisdom over wealth. Nevertheless, the image of Socrates with which we are most familiar remains that of the shabby, barefooted, gregarious and urbane sage who walked daily to the Athenian agora or public marketplace to frequent the booksellers. converse with his friends, engage in good-natured arguments with acquaintances, and take time to answer the questions posed by his pupils and admirers. In the agora, Socrates would not only have kept abreast of all political and social developments in the city, but he would also have become known to all levels of Athenian society, from political elites, priests, and shopkeepers to artists, artisans, laborers, and fellow citizens, both young and old. His daily presence in the heart of Athens made him one of the city's most recognizable figures. Socrates regularly attended philosophical symposia at the homes of his wealthy friends, gatherings that are documented in the writings of both Plato and Xenophon. These social and intellectual gatherings were essentially the ancient Greek equivalent of 18th-century French literary salons, where aristocratic, educated, intellectually accomplished, and avant-garde members of society met to undertake serious examination and discussion of particular points of philosophical inquiry, while also enjoying fine food, wine, and companionship. Throughout his career as quite literally a public intellectual known to all citizens of Athens and willing to engage in dialogue with anyone regardless of their social status, Socrates developed a distinctive body of beliefs and a method of inquiry that became part of the very foundation of modern Western civilization. By the time he reached full intellectual maturity, Socrates had become disillusioned with the natural philosophy that had so fascinated him as a younger man. The fields of physics and natural science remained in their infancy during his era, and the few questions they could claim to answer definitively did not seem to hold much practical or social utility for improving human life. What was the point, he wondered, of understanding the inner workings of the natural world if such knowledge could not address the fundamental question of human existence, namely, how should people live their lives? Instead, he turned his formidable intellect toward epistemological and moral philosophy, to areas of inquiry that he believed were far more consequential for human improvement, individual happiness, and social cohesion. Epistemology, the study of the nature and origin of knowledge itself, counts Socrates among its principal pioneers. What constitutes genuine knowledge? Socrates wondered. How is authentic knowledge acquired? How can we determine whether the knowledge we believe we possess is actually true and reliable? For Socrates, knowledge and proper understanding of it were essential for the attainment of virtue, which in turn he believed was essential for both individual human happiness and broader social harmony throughout the community. Ultimately, the acquisition of genuine knowledge and virtues such as justice, wisdom, courage, piety, and temperate living would produce individuals who behaved according to what was right and just while avoiding actions that were wrong and harmful. People who lived their lives in morally incorrect ways were invariably wretched and miserable. Socrates believed, while those who lived according to proper moral principles experienced genuine happiness and fulfillment. For Socrates, the continuous search for self-knowledge was absolutely paramount. The unexamined life, he famously declared, is not worth living. Alongside self-knowledge, Socrates believed that moral improvement and the cultivation of the soul were equally important goals for all people, both as individuals seeking personal fulfillment and as members of their broader communities seeking social harmony. In addition to his pioneering work in epistemology and ethics, Socrates also developed the techniques known to philosophers as the elenchus, the dialectic, and what modern teachers call the Socratic method. This approach is essentially a structured question and answer style of conversation designed to promote learning and understanding. The elenchus is a process of systematic cross-examination designed to expose the inaccuracy or inconsistency of another person's belief or hypothesis, while the dialectic represents a more collaborative question and answer exchange intended to encourage reasoned conclusions and genuine knowledge to emerge through cooperative inquiry. The dialectical approach resembles what Socrates pursued during philosophical symposia and what teachers who embrace the Socratic method employ in their own classrooms when they use guided question-answer techniques to help students reach conclusions as a collaborative group rather than through passive absorption of information. According to Socrates himself, it may have been his use of the elenctic technique that caused significant dislike of him to develop among his fellow Athenians. After all, few people find it easy to appreciate individuals who seem determined to demonstrate that they are not as intelligent or knowledgeable as they believe themselves to be, while defending himself at his own trial. As recorded in Plato's Apology, Socrates narrated a series of events which, when they occurred, could not have failed to spark public resentment against him for what was probably perceived as intellectual arrogance and self-aggrandizement. This famous episode also appears in Xenophon's Memorabilia, though with slight variations and embellishments. According to the story, a friend of Socrates named Seraphon, who was also a fellow philosopher, visited the oracle at Delphi and posed a question: who is wiser than Socrates? To the surprise and perplexity of both men, the oracle replied, without hesitation, no one is wiser than Socrates. This response utterly confounded Socrates, whose first instinct was to reject the notion that he might be the wisest of all human beings. In Xenophon's version of events, Socrates was present when the oracle delivered her famous pronouncement, and he was said to have reflected long and thoughtfully upon the inscription carved above the entrance to Apollo's temple, "Know thyself." This experience, Socrates explained, motivated him to investigate the oracle's claim as thoroughly as possible, believing that he would eventually prove her assessment incorrect. He described approaching and conversing with many of his fellow Athenians, beginning with those generally considered to be the most knowledgeable and accomplished individuals in the city, including politicians, poets, and scholars. However, he observed that all of those whom others believed to be exceptionally wise and who considered themselves to possess superior wisdom were invariably unable to provide convincing defense of their claims to knowledge when subjected to careful questioning. Socrates then turned his attention to skilled artisans and craftsmen, who were indeed knowledgeable and competent within their particular areas of expertise, but possessed little genuine wisdom about higher philosophical concerns. Though many of these craftsmen also believed themselves to be wise beyond their specific trades, they could not demonstrate this broader wisdom under examination. The crucial difference between Socrates and all the individuals he questioned was that he made no claims to superior wisdom or knowledge. "As for me," he famously declared, "all I know is that I know nothing." For Socrates, the near impossibility of ensuring that any knowledge constitutes ultimate and verifiable truth should encourage intellectual humility in all thinking people. The part that he left unsaid, but which his listeners could infer, was that perhaps this intellectual humility was precisely what the Delphic oracle meant when she declared that no one was wiser than no one was wiser. Then no doubt Socrates employed his elenctic method extensively while interrogating his fellow Athenians' claims to wisdom and knowledge. This technique often concluded in what philosophers call aporian, unresolvable logical impasse or dead end in rational argument, where no clear conclusion can be reached, as someone who openly acknowledged that he did not possess all the answers to life's great questions. Socrates was not attempting to provide people with definitive solutions to philosophical problems. Rather, his goal was to demonstrate that through the careful acquisition of knowledge and the rigorous application of reason, one could expose the wrong-headed beliefs and assumptions of those who considered themselves wise and knowledgeable. His ultimate lesson was to question everything, even supposedly settled knowledge and widely accepted beliefs, and to remain aware that no matter how impressive one's intellectual achievements might appear, one always finds oneself standing once again on the frontier of the unknown, with more questions than answers. Unfortunately, but quite predictably, many of his fellow Athenians took serious offense at Socrates' systematic deconstruction of their cherished beliefs and his reduction of their carefully constructed arguments to states of logical aporia. This methodical exposure of intellectual pretension surely made Socrates numerous enemies, some of whom would eventually bring him to trial for his life. The reputation and fame that Socrates achieved during his lifetime in Athens becomes apparent, not only in the works of scholars and philosophers, but also in the creations of artists and playwrights of his era. He was caricatured and satirized in the works of Athenian dramatists, most notably by Aristophanes in his comedy, The Clouds, which premiered in Athens in 423 BC. This theatrical production lampooned Socrates as a skinny, half-mad, stringy-haired ascetic with absurdly high-flown ideas about the nature and workings of the heavens and earth. His character was depicted floating above the stage in a basket suspended by ropes and pulleys, propelled here and there by his own flatulence while discoursing on cosmic mysteries. In some respects, we must acknowledge that comedy has not changed dramatically in more than 2 millennia. Socrates' own discussion and description of Aristophanes' play in Plato's Apology suggests that the philosopher might have attended a performance of the comedy himself when it was staged in Athens. Aristophanes and Socrates appear to have been at least friendly acquaintances, if not actual friends, based on evidence from Plato's Symposium and other texts. These sources and many others written by Plato illustrate that Socrates possessed a playful, easygoing nature and a highly developed sense of humor. Socrates may have found Aristophanes' theatrical portrayal quite amusing at the time of its performance, viewing it as harmless entertainment rather than malicious attack. Sadly, the public attributions made to him in such forums, including claims that he possessed superior knowledge of heavenly and earthly matters, would later be used against him during his trial. Several additional marks against Socrates' public reputation accumulated over the next 15 years, as 2 of his former pupils became involved in political and military developments that many Athenians considered both reprehensible and treasonous, beginning with Socrates' beloved young pupil and friend Alcibiades, who was elected general at the remarkably young age of 30. The handsome, dashing, and boastful Protisch convinced the Athenian assembly to undertake the ambitious Sicilian campaign of 415 to 413 BC, and to place him in command of this massive military expedition. Alcibiades persuaded the assembly to commission hundreds of ships and authorize the deployment of 10,000 hoplite soldiers and 30,000 naval personnel. This force represented by far the largest and most expensive military expedition Athens had ever assembled in its history. However, on the day after this enormous fleet launched toward Sicily, political enemies of Alcibiades leveled serious charges against him for profaning the sacred mysteries of Demeter and Persephone. He was accused of vandalizing numerous shrines dedicated to the god Hermes throughout the city, and of making light of the gods during a private tea masquerade party. When Athenian authorities dispatched troops to Sicily with orders to arrest Alcibiades and bring him back to face trial, he chose to escape and defect to the side of the Spartans rather than return to defend himself against the charges. Alcibiades' betrayal provided significant intelligence advantages to the Spartans and contributed directly to the utter disaster of the Sicilian campaign, which resulted in the greatest military loss of troops and ships in Athenian history up to that point. This catastrophe represented a financial disaster that many Athenians blamed for fatally weakening their military strength at a particularly crucial juncture of the ongoing Peloponnesian War. Athens suffered final defeat at the hands of Sparta in 404 BC, at which time the victorious Spartans installed an oppressive oligarchic council to rule over the formerly democratic city. This governing body became known as the 30 Tyrants, who maintained brutal control over Athens until 403 BC, when they were finally overthrown by pro-democracy Athenians and the previous constitutional system was restored. Prominent among the 30 Tyrants was a man named Creatus, who was another former pupil of Socrates. When Creatius and the rest of the Spartan-backed junta were finally removed from power, pro-democracy Athenians bitterly remembered the association between the hated authoritarian ruler and his former teacher, the well-known philosopher. The anger and resentment directed against these 2 young men, whom many Athenians viewed as arch-traitors to their city and its democratic traditions, inevitably made Socrates appear guilty by association rather than through any direct actions of his own. Socrates' enemies also noted that he had not been censured or punished by Creaus and the 30 tyrants when he courageously refused to arrest Leon of Salamis, a man he knew to be innocent, whom the oligarchs nevertheless wanted to execute. This represents the only documented instance in which Socrates served in any public office. He held a position on the ruling council from 404 to 403 BC, and it was likely only the fall of the tyrannical government that saved him from their wrath for his principled disobedience. Still, after all the upheaval and destruction that had been brought about by two men who had once been students of Socrates, many Athenians continued to mutter darkly about the philosopher and to question whether his pupils' treasonous actions might somehow be attributed to the influence of their mentor. In 399 BC, 3 citizens of Athens, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon formally laid charges against Socrates for impiety and for corrupting the city's youth through his teachings. They claimed that Socrates had denied the existence of the traditional gods of Athens, introduced worship of new deities, boasted of understanding the workings of the heavens and earth, and used his talent for rhetoric to corrupt and lead young people astray from proper civic virtue to modern ears. Few, if any, of these charges sound like crimes that should be prosecutable under law. However, the justice system of classical Athens featured no official prosecutors or defense attorneys. As we understand them today, all criminal prosecutions were initiated by private citizens acting on their own initiative. Both accusers and the accused received equal amounts of time to present their respective cases to the jury. This time limit was determined by a water clock that applied only to the formal speeches of accuser and defendant. The clock was temporarily stopped whenever witnesses were called to provide testimony, allowing for thorough examination of evidence. Criminal cases were heard by the dikasti, or judges of Athens, and verdicts were decided by a jury of 500 Athenian citizens selected entirely by lot from the eligible population. The rationale behind impaneling such extraordinarily large juries was to make bribery or corruption virtually impossible to achieve. Socrates used his allotted time and considerable verbal skills to defend himself as thoroughly and systematically as possible. His complete defense forms the entire text of Plato's Apology, a title that proves ironic, given that there is absolutely nothing apologetic about Socrates' presentation to the jury. Socrates methodically addressed and deconstructed each charge brought against him, demonstrating through careful reasoning that none were founded in verifiable fact or legitimate legal principle. He pointed out that he had inadvertently made enemies of his accusers over the years by exposing their pretensions to wisdom and knowledge as false and unfounded. Incensed by these past humiliations, his accusers were now seeking revenge by leveling charges against him that were based primarily on unfounded rumors, malicious suppositions, and public propaganda that had circulated about Socrates at various times over the years. Despite the logical force of his defense, the jury found Socrates guilty by the narrow margin of just 30 votes out of 501 casta. Remarkably close verdict that suggests the case was far from clear-cut in the minds of his fellow citizens. When the time came for sentencing, Athenian legal procedure provided that a defendant who had been found guilty could propose his own punishment as an alternative to what his accusers demanded. The jury retained the authority to choose between the two options, and defendants often proposed lesser punishments to demonstrate remorse and seek leniency. It was also an opportunity for the jury to exercise their judgment regarding whether the harsher punishment typically demanded by accusers was truly merited by the crime. This system allowed for mercy and proportionality in sentencing. However, Socrates appears to have damaged his own cause significantly at this crucial stage of the trial, though his reasoning remained entirely consistent with his philosophical principles, since he maintained that he was not guilty of the crimes with which he had been charged. Volunteering to accept any punishment would amount to conceding that he had done something wrong, which he firmly denied. He had dedicated his entire adult life to the moral and intellectual improvement of his beloved city. giving freely of his knowledge and instruction to anyone who sought it, never charging fees for his teaching as the sophists did. His shabby clothes, bare feet, and temperate habits clearly testified to his modest lifestyle and lack of concern for material wealth. Deprivations he gladly endured, since he viewed all ambitions for wealth and glory as leading ultimately to unhappiness and moral corruption. In fact, Socrates boldly asserted that instead of being punished for his alleged crimes, he deserved to be rewarded for his public service. He requested that the city of Athens honor him with free meals for life, the same privilege granted to public benefactors and victorious Olympic athletes. This suggestion may well have been delivered with ironic humor, but it certainly did not improve his standing with the jury members who were deciding his fate. Eventually, Socrates concluded his sentencing proposal with an offer to pay a fine of 100 drachmas, which represented approximately 1/5 of his modest estate. If this financial penalty proved unacceptable to the jury, he explained, for friends who were present at the trial, Plato himself, Crito, Critobulus, and Apollodorus had prepared to pay a much larger fine of 3,000 drachmas on Socrates' behalf, demonstrating their loyalty and belief in his innocence. The jury sentenced Socrates to death by an even larger margin than the guilty verdict that had convicted him, a remarkable development that suggests his defiant refusal to show remorse had alienated additional jurors who might otherwise have voted for a lesser punishment. When asked if he had any final words for the court, Socrates addressed the jury directly, dividing his remarks between those who had voted for his acquittal and those who had voted for his conviction. To those citizens who had recognized the justice in his defense, he offered sincere thanks and praise for their civic integrity and judicial wisdom. To those who had condemned him, he stated that they had ultimately condemned themselves in the eyes of history, and he prophesied that future generations would always speak of their actions as deliberately dishonorable and unjust. Nevertheless, as a loyal Athenian committed to the rule of law and constitutional government, he accepted both the verdict and his sentence with dignity. Socrates spent approximately 1 month in prison prior to his execution, an unusually long delay that occurred due to remarkable timing. The day before Socrates' trial began, Athens' annual religious pilgrimage to the island of Delos had commenced. This sacred journey commemorated the legendary hero Theseus' victory over the Minotaur in ancient Crete. According to long-standing Athenian religious tradition, no criminals could be executed in the city until the sacred ship returned from its pilgrimage to Delos. Socrates therefore had to wait several weeks for his sentence to be carried out of, luxury that few condemned individuals in the ancient world were privileged to enjoy. Socrates used this unexpected time wisely, putting his personal affairs in order, spending precious hours with his family, and receiving visits from his many friends and admirers. He was treated with kindness and respect by his jailer, who had grown fond of the philosopher and dreaded having to carry out the execution. Plato's dialogues, Crito and Phaedo, provide detailed documentation of Socrates' final days and the philosophical discussions that he'd occupied his time. His friends, most notably Crito, urgently tried to persuade him to escape from prison, arguing that he had been unjustly condemned, and that even his jailer was willing to facilitate his flight. Socrates steadfastly refused to consider escape, maintaining that he had lived his entire life in Athens under the protection and governance of Athenian law. The city had provided him with education, opportunities, safety, and the framework within which he had chosen to raise his children and pursue his philosophical calling. By choosing to remain in Athens and benefit from its laws and institutions. Throughout his life, he had tacitly agreed to accept the judgments of those same institutions, even when they failed to serve justice properly. Despite the fact that justice had clearly failed him in this instance, that provided no justification for becoming a lawbreaker himself, which would compromise all the integrity and moral authority he had maintained throughout his life. For Socrates, the principle remained absolute. Two wrongs could never make a right, regardless of the personal cost of adhering to this standard. On his final day, Socrates spent private time with his 3 sons and his wife Xanthippe, sharing final words and embraces with those he loved most. As the day progressed, he sent his family away to spare them the emotional trauma of witnessing his execution, which was scheduled to take place at sunset. Socrates used his remaining hours on Earth, engaging in philosophical conversation with his closest friends, exploring fundamental questions about the nature of life and death, sharing his beliefs about the immortality of the soul, and expressing his conviction that death should not be feared as an evil, but might actually represent a liberation from the sufferings of mortal existence. When some of his companions began to weep as sunset approached and the moment of execution drew near, Socrates offered them comfort and reassurance. "Who can say for certain," he asked gently, "whether death might not be better than life?" When his jailer finally arrived carrying the cup of hemlock poison, Socrates bid farewell to all his friends before drinking the deadly mixture without hesitation or complaint. He then lay down calmly on his prison bed to await the end, maintaining his composure and philosophical tranquility. Even in these final moments, Socrates spoke his last recorded words to his faithful friend Crito, before covering his face with a piece of cloth. "Crito, I owe a cock to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt." Scholars have endlessly debated the meaning of this cryptic final statement. Asclepius was the Greek god of healing, worshipped by those seeking cure from illness or protection from disease. Traditionally, people made sacrificial offerings to Asclepius when they recovered from sickness. Did Socrates have an actual outstanding debt to pay to this deity for some previous healing? Did he perhaps view life itself as an illness from which death would provide the cure, prompting him to request a thanksgiving sacrifice? The debate continues among scholars, as do many other discussions relating to the life and meaning of Socrates. Despite the numerous unresolved questions that still surround this remarkable figure, Socrates achieved a level of lasting fame and intellectual immortality that can only be compared to great religious figures in history, such as Buddha, Jesus of Nazareth, or Laozi. All 4 of these transformative teachers placed marked emphasis on self-knowledge and the cultivation of the soul for moral improvement and spiritual development. However, among them, Socrates alone was never deified or worshipped as a divine figure by subsequent generations. This distinction does not mean that Socrates lacked influence on religious thought and development. Nothing could be further from the truth. Socrates' ideas about the nature and immortality of the soul, combined with his sophisticated views on ethics and moral reasoning, had incalculable influence on the early fathers of the Christian Church, and continue to resonate in Christian theological thinking. The Socratic literary canon remains a fundamental component of Christian theological libraries and seminary education. Contemporary scholars furthermore note that Socrates' impact on education, law, and political theory remains strikingly evident throughout modern Western civilization. Socratic teaching methods have become standard practice in Western classrooms. At every level of education, from elementary schools to graduate universities, political and legal scholars continue to debate exactly where Socrates positioned himself on fundamental questions such as democracy versus oligarchy, social contract theory versus civil disobedience, and the proper relationship between individual, conscience, and state authority. Of course, not every subsequent philosopher or writer admired or agreed with Socrates' ideas and methods. Most notably, Friedrich Nietzsche famously attacked the beliefs and influence of Socrates in his 19th-century works Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist, arguing that Socratic rationalism had contributed to the decline of Greek culture and the rise of life-denying philosophical systems. Nevertheless, Socrates' greatest gift to humanity is widely considered to be his championing of empiricism, rational inquiry, and intellectual honesty. Despite his rejection of natural philosophy in favor of moral and epistemological concerns, Socrates never reached any conclusion, even those concerning metaphysical phenomena such as the soul, without employing a reasoned and logical approach that remained open to questioning and criticism. His epistemological framework for establishing Truth, through careful observation and rational analysis, would eventually be developed by Aristotle into the first systematic version of what we now recognize as the scientific method. Finally, Socrates' doctrine of appealing to higher authority helped establish for the first time in Western thought that there existed moral standards beyond the merely political or legal. Authorities higher than those that offered only the threat of force to compel compliance and obedience. For Socrates, this higher authority might be divine command, personal moral conscience, or the demands of reason itself. While he viewed these sources of moral authority as intimately connected, he refused to abandon his principles, even when faced with unjust imprisonment and execution. Although his enemies ultimately succeeded in taking his life, Socrates achieved a profound victory that continues to resonate across the centuries. Plato, Xenophon, and other writers immortalized him as a martyr to truth, integrity, and the pursuit of wisdom, inspiring countless subsequent generations of thinkers to pursue knowledge and virtue regardless of personal cost. The ongoing scholarly quest to understand the historical Socrates continues among researchers and philosophers worldwide. While some might dismiss this effort as futile given the limited sources available and the questions surrounding their authenticity, many historians take their methodological inspiration from Socrates himself, even when one of his dialectical investigations ended in irresolvable aporia, with the sense that definitive answers might never be known or established. Socrates taught that this uncertainty provided no justification for ceasing to ask questions and seek understanding. Although a completely clear picture of the historical Socrates has remained tantalizingly out of reach, scholars will undoubtedly continue pursuing this most elusive figure, who paradoxically looms larger than almost anyone else in the history of Western civilization. Marcus Aurelius, later known as the Philosopher Emperor, entered the world on April 26, 121 AD, in the eternal city of Rome during the height of the Pax Romana, that remarkable era of unprecedented peace and prosperity that blessed the Roman Empire for nearly 2 centuries. Born during the reign of Emperor Hadrian to the praetor Marcus Aurelius, Verus, and Domitia Calvilla, the future emperor initially bore the name Marcus Catilius Severus, derived from his maternal lineage. His father, who was 31 years old at the time of Marcus's birth, served in the important governmental position of praetor, which conferred significant administrative and judicial responsibilities while ranking below the supreme office of consul. Marcus Annius Verus, the elder, had achieved considerable success in Roman political life as a member of the patrician class. But tragedy struck the family when he died in 124 AD at the relatively young age of 34, since he had not yet attained the consulship, which required a minimum age of 32. His death occurred before he could reach the pinnacle of a traditional Roman political career. Marcus's mother, Domitia Calvilla, brought both substantial wealth and noble lineage to the family. Her father, Calvisius Tullus, had achieved the remarkable distinction of serving 2 terms as consul, Rome's highest elected office. Domitia had inherited considerable wealth from her mother's side of the family, including ownership of a large and highly profitable tile and brickworks enterprise located on the outskirts of Rome. This business proved exceptionally lucrative. During the extensive building boom that characterized Rome during this period of imperial expansion and urban development, despite her considerable fortune, Domitia never remarried after her husband's untimely death, choosing instead to dedicate herself to raising her children and managing her substantial business interests. Following the well-established customs of Roman elite families, shortly after his birth, Marcus was entrusted to the care of a wet nurse, a practice that the distinguished historian Tacitus strongly disapproved of in his writings on proper child rearing. Approximately 1 or 2 years after Marcus's birth, his mother gave birth to a daughter named Annia Cornificia Faustina, who would remain close to her brother throughout their lives. Young Marcus was raised primarily in the household of his paternal grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, who formally adopted the boy following his father's death. This grandfather's political ambitions had been responsible for the Annius Family's recognition and subsequent admission to the prestigious patrician class by Emperor Vespasian, sometime during his reign from 69 to 79 AD. In his later philosophical work, The Meditations, Marcus would write fondly about his grandfather, stating, "From my grandfather Verus, I learned decency and a mild temper." This tribute suggests the profound positive influence that this patriarch exercised on the future emperor's character development. Marcus's early years were spent in the family residences located on the Celian Hill, one of Rome's 7 historic hills. This affluent district commanded sweeping views northward across the city and featured magnificent structures, including the imposing Lateran Palace and the barracks housing the equites singulares, the elite imperial horse guards responsible for the emperor's personal protection. The family's material circumstances were quite comfortable, and Marcus's maternal great-grandfather, possibly step-great-grandfather Lucius Catilius Severus, also played an important role in his upbringing. Evidence suggests that Marcus enjoyed the most extensive contact with this distinguished elder, who contributed significantly to his early education and moral formation. Although Marcus spared for by nurses and tutors and benefited from strong male role models, his mother Domitia continued to exercise a substantial and positive influence throughout his childhood. It was perhaps from her a vastly wealthy member of an ancient patrician family that he learned the value of humility, demonstrated by her decision to live simply and without the lavish displays that were common among Rome's elite. Years later, Marcus would pay tribute to his mother's influence, writing, "From my mother, I learned piety, generosity, the avoidance of wrongdoing, and even the thought of it. Also simplicity of living, well clear of the habits of the rich." This testimony reveals how profoundly her example of modest living despite great wealth shaped his later philosophical outlook. Marcus was a remarkably serious child from his earliest years, and perhaps this natural solemnity led to his later fascination with philosophy, particularly the Stoic school of thought that would guide him throughout his life. While still a young boy at the age of 6, well before beginning formal education, Marcus received the extraordinary honor of enrollment in the equestrian order by personal nomination of Emperor Hadrian himself. This official induction into the Order of the Equites required qualification based on substantial wealth, but also demanded additional requirements that made it highly exclusive. Under reforms implemented by Augustus, the senatorial order and equestrian order had been separated, according to specific wealth categories. The equestrian order required property worth at least 100,000 denarii, while the senatorial order demanded assets of at least 250,000 denarii. However, the equestrian order contained further subdivisions established by Augustus. Anyone who met the basic property requirement of 100,000 denarii could hold the title of eques, but only those specifically granted the equus publicus by an emperor could be admitted to the order and hold the distinguished title of equites equo. Through Hadrian's action, Marcus gained admission to this exclusive order, and while his remarkably young age was unusual for such recognition, it was not entirely unprecedented in Roman history. This early imperial favor clearly indicated that the emperor saw exceptional promise in the young boy. When Marcus reached the age of 7 and was considered old enough to leave the care of his nurses, he began receiving a comprehensive education that followed the traditional Roman pattern. After completing elementary instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic, he received advanced training in literature and elementary Greek language from Euphorion, while Geminus taught him Latin pronunciation, elocution, and possibly dramatic arts. During this same period, Marcus gained admission to the prestigious priestly college of the Salii, despite not meeting both standard requirements, which traditionally demanded patrician birth and having both parents still living. Either his formal adoption by his grandfather or his enrollment by Hadrian superseded the latter requirement, suggesting special imperial favor toward the promising young man. The Salii were associated with the worship of Mars, the god of war, and Marcus participated in their elaborate rituals and ceremonies. These included involvement in the Quinquatris, the opening ceremony, and Armilustrium, the closing ceremony of the military campaigning season in March and October, respectively, as well as the magnificent processions that accompanied these important religious observances as Marcus advanced through the ranks of this ancient priesthood, fulfilling his sacred duties with characteristic diligence. An omen supposedly occurred that foretold his future imperial destiny. When the young priests cast their ceremonial crowns onto the banqueting couch of the god Mars, as was traditional practice, Marcus's crown fell directly onto the brow of the divine statue, as if he had carefully placed it there, while the others fell randomly. This event was later interpreted as a divine sign of his future role as emperor. Marcus's secondary education began at age 11 or 12 when he commenced studies at the grammaticus level. During this phase, he learned music and geometry from Andron, Greek grammar from the distinguished scholar Alexander of Kotiam, and Latin from several accomplished teachers, including Trosius, Aper, Pallio, and Eutychius Proculos. Emperor Hadrian, who continued to take personal interest in the boy's development, bestowed upon him the nickname Verasimus, meaning most truthful, in recognition of his serious devotion to learning and his remarkably mature attitude toward his studies. Another significant tutor during this period was Diognetus the painting master, who almost certainly was the first person to introduce philosophy to young Marcus. This introduction would prove transformative for the future emperor's intellectual development. Later, in his meditations, Marcus would write extensively about Diognetus and acknowledge his profound influence on his philosophical awakening. So powerfully did philosophy capture Marcus's imagination that at the tender age of 12, he eagerly attempted to embrace the austere lifestyle of a cynic philosopher. He adopted rough Greek clothing and insisted on sleeping on the hard floor rather than in a comfortable bed, until his concerned mother intervened and persuaded him, with considerable reluctance on his part, to sleep on animal skins instead. At this early stage of his philosophical development, it appears that Marcus was attracted to the rigorous Cynic school of philosophy, which emphasized radical simplicity and rejection of conventional comforts and social expectations. At 14 years of age, most likely during the Liberalia festival in 136 AD, Marcus formally assumed the toga virilis, the white toga worn by adult Roman men, marking his official transition from childhood to manhood within the empire. This important ceremony included discarding the protective amulet he had worn around his neck since childhood, which he had received from his father during the purification ceremony held 9 days after his birth. Upon receiving the toga virilis, Marcus shed his childhood name of Catilia Severus and adopted his family name of Annius Verus, signifying his new status as an adult citizen. This crucial step into manhood proclaimed him as a full citizen of the empire, ready to assume his responsibilities in public life despite his continuing education. Shortly after, Marcus assumed adult status. Emperor Hadrian, who had maintained active interest in the young man's development despite frequently being absent from Rome on imperial business, expressed his desire that Marcus should be betrothed to Caesonia Fabia, daughter of Lucius Cianius Commodus. Cianius was serving as consul in 136 AD, and it was likely he who appointed Marcus as an honorary prefect of Rome during the Feriae Latinae or Latin festival. This festival took place outside Rome in the town of Albano, and since the consuls were required to remain within the city to carry out their essential administrative duties, appointing Marcus as prefect enabled the consul to be absent for the duration of the festival while ensuring that governmental functions continued uninterrupted. Despite his youth and inexperience, Marcus conducted himself with remarkable maturity and competence in the presence of magistrates and during his attendance at Hadrian's elaborate banquets and social gatherings. This impressive performance in sophisticated adult company further enhanced his reputation and standing with the emperor. This newfound connection with Cianius led to Marcus's introduction to Apollonius of Chalcedon, who had previously served as Cianius's tutor and was recognized as one of the leading Stoic philosophers of the era. This meeting would prove highly significant for Marcus's intellectual development and philosophical orientation. Also around this time, Marcus's sister, Ennia Cornificia Faustina, married Amadius Quadratus, creating additional family connections within Rome's aristocratic circles, in an early display of the generosity that would characterize his entire life. When Marcus's mother asked him to allow his sister to receive part of the inheritance left to him by his father, Marcus not only readily agreed, but stated that he would be happy for her to take the entire inheritance. Furthermore, he suggested that Ennia should receive the full share of their mother's estate as well, ensuring that his sister would not be financially disadvantaged compared to her husband's family. Marcus, who clearly was not inclined toward greed thanks to his mother's influence and example, declared that he was completely content with the fortune he would inherit from his still living grandfather. The closing months of 136 AD brought the future of the entire empire into question when Hadrian suffered a severe hemorrhage and nearly died, forcing urgent consideration of the succession question. With no biological children of his own, Hadrian faced the critical challenge of choosing an heir to succeed him as emperor. The emperor made his choice and officially adopted Sianes, renaming him alias Caesar in preparation for eventual succession. To many contemporary observers, this selection seemed puzzling, and given Hadrian's well-known personal relationship with Antinous, some suspected that the choice was based on emotional attachment rather than objective merit. However, there may have been additional political calculations involved in this decision. Years earlier, in 118 AD, Avidius Nigrinus had been executed on Hadrian's orders for his apparent involvement in a conspiracy to assassinate the emperor. Had Nigrinus survived, there is reasonable evidence suggesting he might have become Hadrian's chosen heir, and since Sianeus had married Nigrinus's daughter, this adoption could have represented Hadrian's attempt to make amends for his earlier harsh actions. Although this explanation seems plausible, it is equally possible that Hadrian chose Sianeus based on his background and aristocratic connections, which Marcus's own prominent family also enhanced through the proposed marriage alliance. The matter appeared settled, but not without bloodshed, as Hadrian ordered other potential candidates for the succession to commit suicide. Among the victims were Servianus, Hadrian's 90-year-old brother-in-law, and his grandson, Pedonius Fuscus Salinator. Although Servianus complied with the emperor's deadly request, he publicly proclaimed his innocence and openly cursed Hadrian, declaring, "May he long for death but be unable to die before ending his own life." This curse would prove remarkably prophetic in light of subsequent events. However, Sianes's succession was not destined to occur. The Senate had expressed significant displeasure with Hadrian's choice from the beginning, and after making a less than favorable impression in his new role, Hadrian decided that Sianeus should embark on a tour of military service to gain necessary experience and credibility. Sianes was dispatched to Carnuntum in the Danube region with proconsular authority over the Pannonian provinces, tasked with suppressing unrest that had developed among local tribes and restoring their allegiance to Rome. The tour proved brief, and Sianes returned to Rome during the winter of 137 AD. He was scheduled to deliver an important speech to the Senate on the first day of 138 AD, but shortly after returning home from his military service, he fell seriously ill and died on January 1, 138 AD, most likely from tuberculosis. His sudden death once again threw the succession into uncertainty. By this time, Servianus's curse appeared to have taken effect, as Hadrian was suffering from advanced dropsy and other serious health problems. The emperor was once again forced to address the succession issue that he had believed was permanently resolved 2 years earlier. After enduring several weeks of political turmoil and personal anguish, Hadrian convened a meeting of his concilium on January 24, which happened to be his 62nd birthday, to settle the succession question definitively. At this crucial meeting, Hadrian named Aurelius Antoninus as his chosen heir, as a condition of his adoption as heir. Antoninus was required to adopt both Sianes's son Lucius and Marcus, who was Antoninus's nephew by marriage. However, like the earlier adoption of Sianes, Antoninus's elevation caused considerable discontent among the Roman political establishment. Antoninus lacked the experience and seniority that many of his contemporaries possessed, and his adoption was said to have caused pain to many prominent Romans, including Marcus's great-grandfather, L. Catilius Severus. Severus had served as consul alongside Antoninus in 120 AD, but was senior to him, having served a second consular term that gave him greater prestige and authority. It became apparent that Severus had harbored his own plans to secure a place in the imperial succession for himself or his family. As punishment for these ambitions, he was subsequently removed from office and replaced by a nobleman of little consequence, who posed no threat to the new succession arrangement. The formal adoption ceremony took place on February 25, 138 AD, along with the adoptions of both Marcus and Lucius. Following these legal proceedings, the boys became known as Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus and Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus, respectively. At Hadrian's specific request, Antoninus arranged the betrothal of his daughter Faustina to Lucius, further cementing the familial bonds that would secure the imperial succession. Perhaps it was because of his naturally unassuming character, his lack of personal greed, and his early philosophical influences that when Marcus discovered he had been adopted into the imperial family, he was reportedly dismayed by this dramatic change in his circumstances. Only with great reluctance did he move from his cherished childhood home on the Celian Hill to a private residence owned by Hadrian, preferring his previous quiet life of study to the political spotlight that now illuminated his every move. Arrangements were soon made for Marcus to step formally into public life when he was appointed to hold the quaestorship for the following year, 139 AD, alongside Antoninus, who would serve as consul for the second time. While it was not unusual for an imperial heir to hold public office, the minimum age requirement for the position of quaestor was 24, and Marcus was only 17 years old at the time of his appointment. Hadrian personally intervened and requested that Marcus be granted an exemption from this legal requirement, demonstrating once again the emperor's confidence in the young man's abilities and character. Despite being elevated not only within the ordinary political sphere, but into the imperial family itself, Marcus remained unchanged by these honors, continuing to display the thoughtful and generous character that had marked his earlier years. However, Hadrian's deteriorating health soon brought these transitional arrangements to a crisis. The emperor's condition became so desperate that he made several attempts to take his own life to escape his suffering. As his physical state continued to decline, he grew increasingly violent and unpredictable, eventually retiring to his villa at Bai on the Campanian coast to spend his final days. Antoninus was left to govern Rome in the emperor's absence, but he soon traveled to Bai at Hadrian's urgent request when it became clear that death was imminent. Antoninus remained by the emperor's side when Hadrian died on July 10, 138 AD, bringing to an end one of the most remarkable reigns in Roman history. Immediately following Hadrian's death, Antoninus faced the responsibility of making private funeral arrangements for his adoptive father. Back in Rome, Marcus was entrusted with making the public proclamations announcing the emperor's death and possibly organizing the public funeral ceremonies, as well as arranging gladiatorial games of his own initiative in Hadrian's honor. Marcus's Aunt Faustina, acting on instructions from the new emperor Antoninus, approached Marcus with a proposal that he should end his betrothal to Caesonia Fabia and instead consent to be betrothed to Antoninus's much younger daughter, Faustina the Younger. This change would require dissolving her current engagement to Lucius, but it would strengthen the bonds between Marcus and his adoptive father. Marcus readily agreed to this new arrangement, though the couple would not actually marry until 145, due to Faustina's young age at the time of their betrothal. Later, in 138 AD, Antoninus became involved in a significant political struggle against the Senate regarding the deification of Hadrian, although much of the ruling class opposed honoring the deceased emperor in this manner. Antoninus successfully forced the motion through the Senate, thereby securing his own position as the legitimate successor while fulfilling his filial duties to his adoptive father. Following the official funeral ceremony, Antoninus won over many senators through his actions in commuting or reversing many of Hadrian's final harsh decrees, for which he received the honorary name Pius. This cognomen may also have related to his respectful treatment of the aged Annius Verus, Marcus's grandfather, when he assisted the elderly man in entering the Senate house, another demonstration of the filial piety that characterized his reign. With these political transitions completed, the essential work of governing the vast empire continued under Antoninus's capable leadership. Antoninus served as consul in 139 AD alongside C. Bruttius Praesens, and he made some changes within the ruling class. But in general, the empire enjoyed remarkable stability and peace during his reign. Marcus assumed his position as quaestor, as planned, serving primarily as secretary to the emperor and reading Antoninus's letters aloud in the Senate, when the emperor could not be present in person. This role provided invaluable training in the practical aspects of imperial administration and governance. Antoninus conferred numerous honors upon young Marcus, beginning when he was designated as consul for 140 AD, despite being still well below the usual age requirement for this distinguished office. Antoninus planned to serve as his colleague in the consulship, providing guidance and mentorship during Marcus's first experience in Rome's highest elected position. In addition to the consulship, Marcus received appointment as Severi in the annual parade of knights and, by right of his elevated standing, became head of the equestrian order with the title Princeps Iuventutis. In recognition of his position within the line of succession, his name was officially changed to Marcus Aurelius Verus Caesar. By order of the Senate, Marcus was also inducted into several prestigious priestly colleges, further cementing his status as heir apparent. Although the full power of the Caesar was not yet his to wield, Marcus remained the level-headed and modest young man he had always been. Years later, he would write in his meditations, "See that you do not turn into a Caesar. Do not be dipped into the purple dye, for that can happen." While he was willing to accept the enormous responsibility that his future office would entail, he was determined not to allow his newfound position and power to corrupt his character or change his fundamental nature. This philosophical approach to power was only reinforced when, in accordance with his elevated position, he moved into the house of Tiberius, the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, at Antoninus's request. Additional honors and positions followed in rapid succession. But despite his increasingly public life, Marcus continued his education with the same dedication he had always shown. Marcus studied under many distinguished tutors throughout these years, and it is likely that his rhetorical training had begun once he assumed the toga virilis. In Greek language and literature, he received instruction from Annius Macer, Caninius Celer, and later the renowned Herodotus Atticus. His Latin oratory training was supervised by the distinguished Cornelius Fronto, though both Herodotus and Fronto probably did not begin tutoring him until after his adoption by Antoninus. Legal studies were conducted under the guidance of Lucius Valasius Massianus. Philosophy was not neglected in Marcus's comprehensive education, and his earlier tutor, the Stoic philosopher Apollonius, returned to Rome at Antoninus's specific request to resume instructing Marcus. However, when summoned to the imperial palace for this purpose, Polonius demonstrated the independence typical of Stoic teachers by retorting, "The master ought not to come to the pupil, but the pupil to the master." Consequently, Marcus received his philosophical instruction at Apollonius's residence in Rome, though how much of this teaching focused specifically on philosophy rather than rhetoric during this period remains unclear from the surviving evidence. An extensive series of letters exchanged between Marcus and his most prominent tutor, Fronto, provides fascinating insight into the intellectual development of the future emperor. These correspondences reveal a young man eager to learn and genuinely grateful to his tutor for both instruction and constructive criticism, which Marcus readily accepted and used to improve his own performance. In one letter, Marcus expressed considerable anxiety about writing a speech of thanks to the Senate, demonstrating the natural nervousness of youth when faced with important public responsibilities. However, he also frequently expressed sincere affection for his tutor and felt genuine guilt when Fronto experienced physical pain from traveling between Rome and Centum Cell, where Marcus was staying for a period. Marcus was even willing to forego parts of his studies to avoid causing his beloved teacher further discomfort, showing the consideration and empathy that would characterize his later reign as emperor. While Marcus was undoubtedly a serious and studious young man, he was not afraid of physical work or manual labor. In another letter to Fronto, he described spending a day gathering grapes and working alongside the laborers in the vineyards at Cuae, one of Antoninus's country estates, showing his willingness to engage in honest work regardless of his elevated social position. Even the serious-minded Marcus allowed himself occasional moments of youthful mischief. In a further letter, he recounted riding down a narrow country road only to find his way blocked by a flock of sheep, when a shepherd commented that he should be careful of horsemen because they steal the most. Marcus spurred his mount forward and rode directly at the sheep, scattering them in all directions. The shepherd responded by throwing his crook at Marcus, though it missed its target and instead struck another member of his riding party. These anecdotes reveal a young man who, despite his serious philosophical interests and heavy responsibilities, retained a sense of humor and capacity for playful behavior. In 140 AD, Marcus assumed his position as consul, and his governmental responsibilities increased significantly. The consulship represented the pinnacle of the traditional Roman political career, and through his duties in this office, Marcus gained invaluable experience in helping to govern the vast empire under Antoninus's guidance. It was during his consulship that Marcus began receiving practical education in statecraft and imperial administration, with Antoninus serving as an exceptional mentor whose influence Rus would later acknowledge extensively in his philosophical writings. Marcus was likely present in his capacity as consul during discussions concerning military troubles in Britain and Dacia, and although he possessed no military inclinations or experience at this time, this exposure to strategic planning would serve to educate him about matters of war and imperial defense. During the closing stages of 140 AD, Empress Faustina, the elder, died, and Marcus was probably involved in the elaborate preparations for her state funeral and subsequent deification. This experience provided additional insight into the ceremonial and religious responsibilities that accompanied imperial office. Marcus's early exposure to political diplomacy and his ongoing studies in philosophy served him well when a personal conflict arose between his tutors Herodotus, Atticus, and Fronto. They found themselves opposing each other in a legal case they were both advocating. In carefully crafted correspondence to both men, Marcus argued diplomatically that neither should attack the other's character, even when defending their own positions and interests. Fronto agreed with this principle to some extent, but insisted that serious crimes must be addressed directly, though he conceded this could be accomplished without resorting to character assassination. Fronto also took the opportunity to provide a gentle lesson to Marcus, delivering a slight rebuke for having dictated his letter rather than writing it himself, reminder that attention to detail and personal effort were important even in routine correspondence. Both Herodotus and Fronto, regardless of their personal feelings toward each other, would achieve the honor of serving as consul in 143 AD, though Fronto, as a novus homo or new man without aristocratic ancestry, served only as suffect consul for the months of July and August, rather than holding the more prestigious ordinary consulship for the full year. During this period, Marcus was once again away from Rome, residing in Naples for reasons that are not entirely clear from the surviving historical record. The year 145 AD marked another significant milestone when Marcus became consul for the second time, once again serving alongside Antoninus as his colleague. During this term, Marcus gained hands-on experience dealing with military crisis when an uprising occurred in Mauritania, the Roman province in North Africa. In a letter to Fronto, Marcus complained about the enormous volume of correspondence that this crisis generated, providing insight into the administrative burden that accompanied military operations throughout the empire. Around this same time, Lucius Marcus's adoptive brother likely received the toga virilis, marking his own transition to adulthood. Though relatively little information about his early years has survived in the historical record. In April 145 AD, one of the most joyful events of Marcus's young life occurred when he married Faustina, the younger, in a ceremony that was celebrated throughout the empire. Since both bride and groom belonged to the patrician class, their wedding followed the ancient conferratio ceremony, which was officiated by Antoninus himself in his capacity as Pontifex Maximus. Commemorative coins bearing images of the happy couple were struck to mark this important dynastic union, and the marriage would prove to be both loving and fruitful, though it would also be marked by the frequent sorrows of infant mortality that affected even the imperial family. Although Marcus was generally eager to pursue his studies throughout this period, by 146 AD he began to express dissatisfaction with certain aspects of his education and voiced his displeasure with some of the more advanced exercises that Fronto assigned to him by early 147 AD. When Marcus was 25 years old, his formal education finally came to an end, allowing his interest in philosophy to develop more fully. While he had been influenced initially by Apollonius, he also began studying under Quintus Junius Rusticus, who was descended from a martyr to the tyranny of emperor, and brought both philosophical wisdom and political insight to his teaching. Marcus was also influenced by his friendships with distinguished men such as Claudius Severus and Claudius Maximus, whose conversations and example contributed significantly to his intellectual and moral development alongside his formal philosophical instruction. Another prominent influence during this period was Sextus of Chaeronea, a teacher of philosophy, who had avoided any public career in order to focus entirely on philosophical inquiry and instruction. Marcus would continue attending Sextus's lectures throughout his life, even after becoming emperor, demonstrating his lifelong commitment to learning and philosophical development. Each of these influential mentors and friends would eventually be featured in the first book of Marcus's Meditations, where he described in detail what he had learned from their teachings and example, providing valuable insight into the intellectual influences that shaped the future emperor's character. The year 147 AD proved significant for Marcus in ways beyond the completion of his formal education, as his first child with Faustina was born late in that year. This daughter would be the first of many children born to the couple, though, as was tragically common during this era, many would not survive to adulthood. The day following the birth of their first child, Faustina received the distinguished title of Augusta, while Marcus was granted the tribunation power and imperium, marking his formal recognition as heir apparent to the imperial throne. While in other Roman careers, this might have been followed by a period of military service abroad, such was not the case for Marcus. Antoninus himself possessed relatively limited military experience beyond Italy's borders and did not consider foreign military service necessary for Marcus's preparation for eventual rule. Neither Antoninus nor Marcus would undertake any major military expeditions during Antoninus's peaceful reign as emperor. In 148 AD, Rome celebrated its 900th anniversary with elaborate public games sponsored by Antoninus, providing spectacular entertainment for the population and reinforcing the majesty and continuity of Roman civilization. Around the same time in the distant east, a new king ascended to the throne of Parthia. It's an event that would eventually create serious problems for Marcus during his own future reign. The year 149 AD marked the beginning of a particularly difficult period for Marcus and Faustina, as she gave birth to twin sons whose arrivals were celebrated throughout the empire and commemorated on the year's official coinage. However, by the end of 149 AD, both infants had died and were interred within Hadrian's magnificent mausoleum, bringing profound grief to their parents. Another daughter was born the following year, but the pattern of frequent births and tragic early deaths continued throughout the 150s. Although Faustina gave birth to several more sons and daughters between 150 and 156 AD, imperial coinage from the latter year depicts only 2 surviving daughters, indicating the continued loss of children during this period. Marcus suffered additional personal losses when his beloved sister died in 152 AD. And although the exact date is not recorded, his mother Domitia passed away sometime after 155 AD. Throughout this emotionally tumultuous period, Marcus maintained correspondence with Fronto. Though remarkably, none of the surviving documents contain any mention of these personal losses and bereavements. The Stoic philosopher Apollonius had taught Marcus that loss should be borne with dignity and acceptance, and it appears that he applied these philosophical principles in his personal correspondence as well as in his private life. During this same period, Lucius successfully held his quaestorship in 153 AD and then achieved the consulship in 154 AD, both offices before reaching the traditional minimum ages, though not as early as Marcus had received these same honors. The adoptive brothers possessed quite different personalities. While Lucius demonstrated a love of sports and was described as carefree with a particular enthusiasm for gladiatorial spectacles, Marcus remained serious-minded and appeared to find such violent entertainments rather tedious, despite these differences in temperament and interests. There seems to have been no rivalry or animosity between the 2 young men, who maintained cordial relations throughout their lives. Marcus's governmental responsibilities likely increased as Antoninus aged and relied more heavily on his capable heir. In 160 AD, Marcus shared the consulship with Lucius, providing both young men with additional experience in the highest levels of Roman administration. However, early in 161 AD, the peaceful transition of power that had been carefully planned for so many years finally became necessary when Antoninus died following a brief illness. The empire was now ready to pass into Marcus's capable hands. When the Senate met to confirm Marcus as the new emperor, surprised everyone by refusing to accept the imperial throne unless Lucius was simultaneously made joint emperor alongside him. This unprecedented arrangement reflected partly his sense of obligation to honor Hadrian's original intentions, but perhaps also his desire to share the enormous burden of governing the vast Roman Empire. The Senate agreed to this unusual proposal, and the adoptive brothers became joint rulers of Rome. Marcus held the senior position with the title of Pontifex Maximus, while Lucius held the title of Pontifex. From this point forward, they were known officially as Imperator Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus and Imperator Caesar Lucius Aurelius Verus Augustus. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was essential for any emperor's survival, required careful management during this transition, following a precedent established by Emperor Claudius over a century earlier. Upon their accession, Marcus and Lucius promised each Praetorian guardsman 5,000 denarii and higher sums to the officers, ensuring their support for the new regime. This occasion marked the first time that Marcus and Lucius were formally hailed as imperator by their troops. Marcus would eventually be acclaimed imperator a total of 10 times during his reign in recognition of various military victories achieved. Under his leadership, arrangements for Antoninus's funeral and deification proceeded smoothly, with no opposition from the Senate, and his ashes were respectfully interred in Hadrian's mausoleum alongside previous emperors. Following the deification ceremony, Marcus announced the betrothal of his daughter Lucilla to Lucius, though she was still too young for immediate marriage. Later in August 161 AD, Faustina gave birth to another set of twins, Antoninus and Commodus, bringing joy to the imperial family. However, the early untroubled months of their joint reign were not destined to last long. During the latter part of 161 AD, Rome faced a series of natural disasters that tested the new emperor's administrative capabilities. The Tiber River flooded, with unprecedented severity, destroying numerous buildings, drowning large numbers of livestock, causing widespread famine, and triggering a serious outbreak of malaria within the city. Communities affected by the famine received relief through the distribution of grain from the city's reserves and financial assistance from the imperial treasury. But an earthquake at Cyzicus in Asia Minor placed additional strain on the empire's finances and resources. The Tiber had a long history of flooding Rome. And although discussions had been held over the years about better protecting the city through engineering projects, no comprehensive solutions had ever been seriously implemented. Marcus made some efforts to address this persistent problem, but never achieved a complete solution. Coupled with these domestic disasters, the eastern frontiers of the empire suddenly came under serious threat from foreign enemies. The Parthian king Vologases IV, who had ascended to power during Antoninus's peaceful reign, launched an attack against Armenia, which was under Roman protection, expelling the pro-Roman ruler and installing a member of the Parthian royal family in his place. The Roman response to this aggression proved initially disastrous. M. Sidatius Severionis, serving in his capacity as governor of Cappadocia, led one legion into Armenia but became trapped by the Parthian general Chasros. Realizing that his situation was hopeless and that he could not achieve victory, Severionis chose to commit suicide rather than face capture, and his entire legion was subsequently massacred by the enemy forces. The military crisis was not confined to the eastern provinces, as war simultaneously threatened Britain, while Upper Germany and Rhaetia faced invasion by the Chatti tribe. Marcus and Lucius found themselves confronting multiple serious threats. Despite having no significant military experience upon which to base their strategic decisions up, crucial gap in their education that Antoninus's peaceful reign had failed to address, recognizing their need for experienced military advisors, Marcus undertook a comprehensive reorganization of key governmental positions, replacing the current AB epistolist with Tivarius Clemens, a man with extensive and varied military experience. This reorganization continued with the appointment of proven commanders to critical positions. Statius Priscus replaced the deceased Severinus in the east, while he was in turn replaced in Britain by Sextus Calpurnius Agricola, Afronto's son-in-law. Ophidius Victorinus was dispatched to Upper Germany as governor. 3 complete legions plus various detachments were withdrawn from the northern frontiers and sent eastward to reinforce the armies facing the Parthians. But Rome suffered additional defeats when the enemy forces invaded Syria, sometime during late 161 or early 162 AD. The joint emperors made the crucial decision that Lucius should personally lead the eastern campaign. Lucius was supposedly chosen for this role because his physical robustness made him better suited to military activity, though the assignment may also have been intended to build and reform his character through the challenges of command responsibility. Marcus would remain in Rome to handle the essential business of governing the empire, ensuring that administrative and domestic affairs continued to function smoothly during the military crisis. However, Lucius would not undertake this dangerous mission alone. He was to be accompanied by selected members of the Praetorian Guard and M. Pontius Laelianus Larcius Sabinus, a distinguished military officer with extensive combat experience, who was appointed cum Augustorum companion of the emperors. Sabinus's proven expertise made him someone Marcus could rely upon for practical military advice regarding the eastern theater of operations. Marcus also decided to send his first cousin, M. Annius Libo, to serve as governor of Syria, where he could oversee Lucius's conduct and provide additional guidance to the inexperienced commander. Lucius departed from Rome later in 162 AD, with Marcus accompanying him partway on his journey eastward. When Lucius subsequently fell ill during the journey, Marcus rushed to his side, fearing the worst. It appeared that Lucius had suffered a mild stroke, but he recovered sufficiently to continue with his mission and eventually arrived at Antioch, the capital of the Syrian province. Meanwhile, Statius Priscus had arrived to take military command and achieved some success in Syria and in capturing Artaxata, the capital of Armenia. During 163 AD, however, Priscus disappears from the official historical chronicles soon after this victory, leaving his ultimate fate uncertain. The Eastern campaign placed considerable strain on Marcus, who continued corresponding with Fronto about the ongoing war. In one of his replies, Fronto reassured Marcus that military fortunes could shift in their favor, just as they had many times throughout Roman history, encouraging him to maintain confidence in ultimate victory. On the other hand, Lucius appeared to be thoroughly enjoying his Eastern adventure, though not by taking an active part in the actual fighting. Instead, he spent much of his time at luxurious resorts on the outskirts of Antioch, engaging in frivolous activities and social entertainment, far from having the reforming effect on his character that Marcus had hoped for. The Eastern command seemed to enable Lucius to indulge his pleasure-seeking tendencies even more freely than he had in Rome. However, Lucius did eventually take a leading role in training troops in Antioch, where the soldiers had grown lazy and undisciplined during the long period of peace. Taking his military responsibilities seriously for the first time, he finally integrated into camp life and began demonstrating the leadership qualities expected of a Roman commander, perhaps motivated by circulating stories about Lucius's romantic entanglements with a mistress in the East. Marcus made the decision to accelerate the wedding of his daughter, Lucilla, to Lucius in 164 AD. Although Lucilla was still only 14 years old, by Roman standards she had reached marriageable age and could assume the responsibilities of an imperial wife. Escorted by Marcus to the port of Brandisium, Lucilla boarded a ship accompanied by M. Vetulana Civica Barbarus, who was Lucius's paternal uncle. She set sail for Ephesus, where the wedding ceremony would take place. Libo had died during the intervening months, and Barbarus's presence was likely intended to provide the kind of supervision and guidance that Libo had been expected to offer. Lucius met Lucilla in Ephesus as planned, and their wedding was performed with appropriate imperial ceremony, as the junior empress Lucilla received the title of Augusta, marking her official entry into the imperial family. During this same period, significant progress was being made in the Eastern military campaign. The capital of Armenia was re-established, in a location closer to Roman territory for better security, and Sohaemus, who was both a member of the Roman Senate and an Arsacid prince, was crowned as the new king of Armenia by Lucius. This appointment successfully re-established Armenia as a pro-Roman client state under reliable leadership. Despite his reluctance to claim credit for military achievements in which he had not personally participated, Marcus was eventually persuaded by Lucius to share the victory title Armeniacus. Given his philosophical nature and the fact that he had taken no active military role in the Armenian campaign, Marcus presumably felt that accepting this honor was inappropriate, believing that such recognition should be reserved for those who had actually risked their lives in battle. However, Marcus did not remain idle in Rome while others fought on distant frontiers. His earlier education in law now proved invaluable as he undertook significant legal reforms. Evidence survives of his initiatives in several important areas, particularly regarding the manumission of slaves, the appointment of guardians for orphans and minors, and the selection of local councils throughout the provinces. Marcus was instrumental in establishing public registries, maintained by the prefects of the treasury of Saturn, which recorded the names of freeborn children throughout Rome and the provinces. These registries served as official proof of a person's status as freeborn should their legal standing ever be questioned unimportant. Protection in a society where the distinction between free and enslaved persons carried enormous legal and social significance. Marcus increased the total number of court days when legal cases would be heard and decided from the previous schedule to 230 days per year, significantly improving access to justice for Roman citizens. He demonstrated great respect for the Senate by designating senators to judge in legal inquiries even when he himself possessed jurisdiction over such matters. And he consistently sought to ensure that each case received fair and impartial consideration. He granted additional honors and privileges to the Senate, showing the kind of deference and respect that many of his predecessors had ignored in favor of relying primarily on military strength to maintain their rule. This approach reflected both his philosophical commitments and his understanding that sustainable governance required the cooperation of traditional Roman statisticians. The war against the Parthians continued successfully throughout 165 AD, as Roman forces pressed into Osrhoene, making significant gains in the region and eventually capturing Edessa, where they restored the pro-Roman ruler Manus to his rightful position, Marcus. Verus likely pursued the retreating Parthian forces eastward, while Avidius Cassius led the Roman advance southward toward the enemy heartland. The campaign achieved its greatest success when Roman armies reached the twin cities of Seleucia and Ctesiphon on the Tigris River. Seleucia opened its gates to the approaching Roman army without resistance, recognizing that opposition would be futile. Following this diplomatic victory, Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital itself, was captured by Roman forces, and Vologas's royal palace was burned in a symbolic demonstration of Roman triumph. Though the Parthian king himself escaped capture and retained his throne, however, despite the warm welcome that Seleucia had extended to the Roman army, the city was subsequently destroyed, greatly damaging Cassius's reputation for justice and clemency. Seleucia had originally been founded as a Greek city almost 5 centuries earlier, and its destruction represented a significant cultural loss as well as a strategic mistake. With the Eastern War essentially concluded in Rome's favor, Lucius began preparing for his return to the capital, and he commissioned Fronto to write the official history of the Parthian campaign, requesting memoranda from both Cassius and Marcus Verus to ensure accuracy. Lucius also proposed writing his own account of the war, in a display of vanity that revealed his true character. Lucius suggested to Fronto that his personal achievements in the campaign could be embellished and exaggerated in the official history to enhance his reputation and legacy. Attention now turned to preparations for the challenging northern campaigns, where unrest continued along the frontier despite the successful conclusion of the Eastern War. 2 new legions were raised to replace losses and provide additional manpower, while a comprehensive reorganization of the provincial governorships in the northern regions was undertaken to improve military coordination. During this transitional period in 165 AD, Marcus suffered another personal loss when his elder twin son, Antoninus, died, adding to the succession concerns that already weighed heavily on his mind. Perhaps seeking to help his wife cope with her grief over the loss of their son, Marcus agreed that Faustina could travel to the east to be with Lucilla, who was pregnant at the time and could benefit from her mother's support and experience. Meanwhile, Fronto experienced his own personal tragedies when he lost first his wife and shortly thereafter his younger grandson, whom he had never had the opportunity to meet due to the child's early death. Marcus expressed his condolences in a heartfelt letter that demonstrated both his empathy and his philosophical approach to loss. Remarkably, while Marcus offered sincere sympathy for his beloved teacher's pain, he displayed no explicit grief for his own deceased child, suggesting that he had successfully applied stoic principles of acceptance to his personal sorrows. Cassius returned to active campaigning in 166 AD, pressing further into Parthian territory by advancing through Media and securing additional victories that further enhanced Rome's position in the east. Following the successful conclusion of the Median campaign, Lucius finally began his long-awaited journey back to Rome. The legions that had been withdrawn from the northern frontiers returned to their original positions along the Danube, while Cassius was appointed as the new governor of Syria in recognition of his military successes. Fronto died soon after Lucius's return to Rome, leaving his planned history of the Parthian War incomplete, a project that would never be finished. Given the extended period of peace during Antoninus's reign, the triumph celebrating the Parthian victory would be the first held in Rome for almost 50 years when it took place in October 166 AD. This magnificent ceremony provided the Roman people with a spectacular display of imperial success and military prowess. During the triumph preparations, Lucius requested that Marcus's sons, Commodus and Annius Verus, received the title of Caesar in recognition of the dynasty's success and to prepare them for eventual succession. This request was granted, and the young princes rode in the triumphal procession alongside their father and uncle. Both Marcus and Lucius received the distinguished title Pater, Patri, Father of the Fatherland, during these celebrations. Marcus had previously been offered this honor, but had deferred accepting it until Lucius returned from the East, demonstrating his commitment to sharing credit and maintaining the partnership between the joint emperors. However, the time required to achieve victory in the eastern provinces had only delayed addressing the serious troubles that continued to develop along the northern frontier. The Germanic tribes living along the Roman borders had previously maintained peaceful relations with the empire, but increasing pressure from population movements deeper in the European interior was forcing these peoples from their traditional lands as these displaced populations looked southward toward Roman-controlled territory for new homes. Conflict became increasingly inevitable. Initially, the invasion by the Longobardi and Obi tribes in either late 166 or early 167 AD was successfully repelled by Roman forces, and diplomatic envoys were sent to negotiate a lasting peace. The envoys were led by Balamarius, king of the Marcomanni, who met with Aelius Bassus, the governor of Upper Pannonia, to establish terms for continued peaceful relations. A treaty was concluded, oaths of friendship were sworn by both sides, and the envoys returned home to their respective tribes with assurances that hostilities would cease. Despite these diplomatic efforts, and Marcus's sincere intentions to maintain peace through negotiation, circumstances beyond his control made it impossible for him to leave for the northern frontiers as planned. A devastating plague had spread throughout the empire during 167 AD, carried by troops returning from Mesopotamia following the successful conclusion of the Parthian campaign. This epidemic, whose exact nature has never been conclusively identified by modern medical historians, proved catastrophic in its severity, particularly within the densely populated city of Rome and among military units, where close quarters facilitated rapid transmission of disease. The mortality rate was exceptionally high, decimating both civilian populations and military forces. Marcus responded to this public health crisis by enacting comprehensive legislation concerning the movement and burial of the dead, establishing protocols for the lawful interment of plague victims and prohibiting the lawful disturbance of graves for appropriation by others. The construction of private tombs at residential villas was also prohibited as a public health measure, in an attempt to address public anxiety and seek divine intervention to end the plague. Marcus summoned priests from throughout the empire to perform foreign religious rites and conduct purification ceremonies designed to cleanse the city of whatever spiritual contamination might be causing the epidemic. However, Marcus's necessary presence in Rome for certain essential religious ceremonies only further delayed his planned expedition to address the deteriorating situation along the northern frontiers, where developments were occurring that would soon require urgent imperial attention. Lucius, despite serving as consul for the third time in 167 AD, seemed largely unconcerned with these mounting crises, and spent much of his time engaged in pleasurable pursuits. He held elaborate banquets at his villa on the Via Clodia, having brought entertainers with him from Syria, and regularly invited Marcus to attend these social gatherings. Marcus, ever the dutiful adoptive brother and committed to setting a proper example for Lucius, accepted these invitations, but spent his time at these parties engaged in judicial work rather than frivolous entertainment, demonstrating his dedication to public service even during social occasions. The plague, unfortunately, contributed to increased hostility toward the Christian population, as many Romans believed that the epidemic represented punishment from the traditional gods for tolerating this foreign religion. Christians who were accused of practicing their faith were arrested, tried, and executed in significant numbers during this period. Marcus wrote relatively little about Christianity in his surviving works, but in one passage in his Meditations, he reflects on Christian attitudes toward death, noting that they seem to accept martyrdom not as individual choice, but because they had been trained to die, a perspective instilled through their religious teachings that he viewed as contrary to both proper philosophical reasoning and traditional Roman beliefs about death. This was not the first instance of apparent persecution of Christians during Marcus's reign. His friend Rusticus, while serving as prefect in 165 AD, had been involved in a legal case that resulted in the trial of Justin, a prominent Christian teacher, after accusations were brought against him by the Cynic philosopher Crescens. Justin and 5 companions willingly admitted to being Christians and were subsequently scourged and beheaded for their faith, with Justin becoming recognized as a martyr by the Christian community. The peace agreements with the tribes along the northern frontier were proving increasingly fragile and ultimately unsustainable. The Victuali and Marcomanni, whose king had represented the tribal envoys during the earlier peace negotiations, continued causing trouble among neighboring peoples and had seized control of valuable gold mines in Dacia not long after the diplomatic agreements had been concluded. Recognizing that the deteriorating situation required immediate imperial attention, Marcus and a reluctant Lucius finally departed for the northern frontiers in the spring of 168 AD. They initially established their headquarters at Aquileia, where they remained for an extended period to assess the situation and coordinate their response. Marcus issued orders for additional fortifications to be constructed along the frontiers to strengthen Roman defensive positions. But Lucius remained more interested in the excellent hunting opportunities that the region provided than in serious military planning and preparation. When news arrived of a tentative truce agreement with the troublesome tribes, Lucius, who had been less than enthusiastic about continuing northward to the Danube frontier from the beginning, strongly pressed his argument that they should return immediately to the comfort and safety of Rome. Marcus refused this suggestion, maintaining that their presence was essential for addressing the ongoing crisis, and the imperial party crossed the Alps for a brief visit to the frontier region. They established temporary residence at Carnuntum before returning to Aquileia to continue their strategic planning. Marcus intended to spend the winter season at Aquila and resume the Danube campaign the following year with a comprehensive strategy for addressing the tribal movements and territorial pressures. However, with plague still prevalent throughout the region, the renowned physician Galen recommended that the imperial party return to Rome to avoid further exposure to disease. With Lucius continuing to advocate strongly for the same course of action, Marcus eventually acquiesced reluctantly and agreed to accompany his adoptive brother back to the capital, though he remained convinced that their personal presence on the frontier was necessary for maintaining Roman security. However, Lucius would never see Rome again, as fate intervened during their journey southward. He was suddenly taken ill, possibly suffering another stroke, at Altinum, and lingered for 3 days in declining health before dying in January 169 AD, bringing the joint emperorship to an unexpected end. Rumors immediately began circulating regarding the circumstances of Lucius's death, with some malicious gossips even suggesting various conspiracy theories that implicated Marcus, Faustina, and Lucilla in individual plots against him. However, none of these accusations can be given any credence whatsoever, and they appear to have been the product of political enemies seeking to undermine imperial authority during a time of crisis. Marcus personally oversaw the funeral arrangements for his adoptive brother and succeeded in having him deified by the Senate upon their return to Rome, ensuring that Lucius received appropriate honors despite the controversies that had occasionally surrounded his conduct. By this time, the combined effects of the prolonged Eastern War, the devastating plague, and the simultaneous necessity of raising new legions had created a severe financial crisis for the imperial government. Still more troops were urgently needed to replace those who had succumbed to disease, and to fill out the new military units being organized for the northern campaigns. However, recruiting and equipping these additional forces required substantial financial resources that were no longer readily available. Rather than imposing new taxes on an already suffering population, Marcus made the remarkable decision to hold a public auction of palace property, selling valuable imperial possessions to raise the necessary funds for military operations. To further bolster military manpower without excessive cost, Marcus authorized the recruitment of former gladiators, enslaved persons who received their freedom upon enlistment, and even conscripted bandits who were formed into auxiliary units. Additionally, mercenaries were hired from among the Germanic tribes themselves, which helped alleviate the financial burden of recruiting and equipping entirely new troops. Despite these creative solutions, the financial pressures remained severe, and Marcus was ultimately forced to resort to debasing the imperial koinonia, common practice during times of financial difficulty, but one that carried long-term economic consequences for the stability of the monetary system. Marcus's departure for the Danube frontier was delayed further into 169 AD, as he dealt with the complex task of finding a suitable and politically unambitious marriage partner for his daughter Lucilla, Lucius's widow. He also had to cope with the death of another child following an unsuccessful surgical operation to treat a tumor, adding personal grief to his already overwhelming imperial responsibilities. Much of the detailed information about the subsequent Danube campaigns has either not been recorded or has failed to survive in the historical sources. But the initial Roman assault appears to have been unsuccessful and costly in terms of both manpower and morale. After this setback, the date of which remains unknown, the Marcomanni achieved significant success in pushing their attacks into Italy itself, advancing as far as the strategic city of Oculaire while raiding settlements and causing destruction throughout the region. Simultaneous invasions by other tribal groups affected Macedonia, Thrace, and Achaia, creating multiple crisis points that stretched Roman resources to their limits. Lucilla's new husband, Clodius Pompeianus, was appointed to coordinate the response to these widespread invasions and took the future Emperor Pertinax with him to assist in military operations. Through systematic and determined effort, the Germanic tribes were gradually expelled from Italy and the invaded northern provinces. Finally, at the end of the 171 AD campaigning season, the Marcomanni suffered devastating losses when they were trapped by Roman forces at a river crossing on the Danube while heavily laden with spoils from their raids, marking a significant turning point in the war. Simultaneously, the Iberian Peninsula faced invasion when Moorish rebels crossed from North Africa into the province of Baetica. Marcus dispatched Ophidius Victorinus to address this additional crisis, granting him extraordinary authority as governor of both Baetica and Tarraconensis to coordinate the defense of the region. Deprived of the senatorial province of Baetica due to this military reorganization, Marcus compensated the Senate by assigning them Sardinia as a replacement, where the future Emperor Septimius Severus would serve after completing his term as quaestor in Rome. Marcus held diplomatic negotiations with many of the tribal groups, including the Quadi, seeking to isolate the most dangerous threats, such as the Marcomanni, by offering peace terms to peoples who were willing to cease hostilities. He went so far as to form military alliances with some tribes against their traditional enemies. The emperor even granted permission for some tribal groups to settle within Italian territory, though these settlers would later be expelled following a revolt at Ravenna that demonstrated the risks inherent in such policies. By 172 AD, Marcus was finally in a position to resume offensive operations, and Roman forces crossed the Danube to march directly into Marcomanni territory. The campaign involved victories and setbacks for both sides, but it was during this phase of the war that the famous miracles associated with Marcus's reign reportedly occurred. The first alleged miracle involved Marcus summoning a thunderbolt from the heavens that struck directly at enemy forces, demonstrating divine favor for the Roman cause. The second, more famous incident was the rain miracle that occurred during a battle with the Quadi, according to the account. The Quadi had violated peace terms by providing sanctuary to fleeing Marcomanni warriors, and they subsequently surrounded Roman forces on all sides during scorching weather, denying them access to water sources and simply waiting for severe exhaustion and thirst to weaken the Romans before overwhelming them with superior numbers. Unable to retreat from this dangerous position, the Romans continued fighting despite extreme exhaustion from the heat and lack of water. Suddenly, according to the legend, clouds gathered overhead and rain poured down upon them, allowing the soldiers to quench their thirst and continue fighting with renewed strength and ultimate victory. These miraculous events were subsequently depicted on the famous column of Marcus Aurelius, which still stands in Rome today as a testament to his military achievements. Although later Christian writers would claim these miracles as the work of their god, the artistic depictions on the column and contemporary coins clearly show that Marcus attributed divine intervention to traditional Roman deities. Marcus achieved decisive victory over the Marcomanni toward the end of 172 AD, and a comprehensive treaty was negotiated that placed severe restrictions on the defeated tribe. In recognition of this success, both Marcus and his son, Commodus, who was likely present during the campaign, received the victory title Germanicus. Despite these military successes on the northern frontier, serious problems continued to develop in other parts of the vast empire. A rebellion erupted in Egypt, requiring the deployment of Avidius Cassius from his position in Syria to suppress the uprising. Meanwhile, in Armenia, the pro-Roman ruler Sohaemus was deposed by hostile forces. P. Martis Verus, serving as governor of Cappadocia, was dispatched to restore Sohaemus to his throne and re-establish Roman influence in the region. Tiridates, who was believed to be responsible for the trouble in Armenia, was captured and exiled to Britain as punishment for his actions. Marcus had originally intended to return to Rome in 173 AD to celebrate his victories and attend to accumulated administrative business. But the war continued against the Quadi and other smaller tribal groups, primarily consisting of a series of smaller engagements rather than major battles. The earlier treaty with the Quadi had been negotiated with their pro-Roman ruler. This leader was subsequently expelled in favor of Ariogassus, who maintained a hostile attitude toward Rome and its interests. Marcus refused to recognize this new ruler, declining to renew the lapsed treaty agreements, and placed a substantial bounty on Ariogassus, offering rewards for his capture, dead or alive. However, like the earlier case of Tiridates, when Ariogassus was eventually captured, Marcus chose exile over execution, sending him to Alexandria rather than ordering his death. This demonstrates the characteristic clemency that Marcus showed toward defeated enemies throughout his reign. The war then shifted focus to confronting the Sarmatian Jazyges, who attempted to negotiate peace terms during 174 AD. Marcus initially refused their overtures, though little additional information about this phase of the campaign has survived in the historical sources. Despite his active presence on the military frontiers, Marcus continued to fulfill his judicial responsibilities whenever time and circumstances permitted, having always taken these duties extremely seriously throughout his career. However, it appears that during this period he may have been suffering from a stomach ulcer, as the historian Dio describes him as experiencing a serious chest and stomach condition to alleviate his physical discomfort. Marcus was prescribed a theriac or antidote by the physician Galen, which modern medical historians believe likely contained opium among its ingredients. Some scholars suggest that Marcus may have developed a dependency on this medication, as Galen's writings describe periods when the emperor would attempt to discontinue the treatment because it caused drowsiness, but would then find himself unable to sleep and be forced to resume taking it. However, there is no suggestion that Marcus became a helpless addict, and he continued to function effectively as both military commander and imperial administrator. Throughout this period of health difficulties, during these challenging years on the frontier, Marcus was compelled to appoint many individuals of lesser qualifications, in terms of both wealth and experience, to important positions within the Senate and military command structure. This necessity arose from the shortage of traditionally qualified candidates due to deaths during the plague and the ongoing military campaigns. Marcus also issued several important pronouncements on public matters during this period, including decisions regarding the continuation of public games in his absence from Rome and the controversial abolition of mixed bathing. reflecting his continued attention to moral and social issues despite the pressures of military command. It was during the final decade of his life, while dealing with these enormous challenges of war and governance, that Marcus Aurelius began writing what would become his most enduring and influential legacy, the philosophical work known to posterity as the Meditations. This collection consists of 12 books containing his personal reflections on Stoic philosophy, written in Greek and intended entirely for his own use and self-improvement, rather than for publication or public consumption. The Meditations represent a series of private musings and philosophical reflections, composed during quiet moments in his military campaign tent and in the intervals between administrative duties. Throughout his writings, Marcus set himself seemingly impossible standards by contemporary measures and engaged in profound analysis of the triviality, transience, and often callous nature of everyday life and human behavior, while maintaining unwavering dedication to his public duties and responsibilities. Some modern scholars have suggested that the imagery and philosophical themes present in the Meditations may have been influenced by the opium-containing medication he was taking for his ulcer, though there is no conclusive evidence supporting this theory, regardless of any potential external influences. The Meditations have been recognized by many literary and philosophical critics as among the greatest works ever written, though they were not intended as original philosophical treatises, but rather as personal applications of established Stoic principles to the challenges of imperial life. One of the most prominent themes that emerges throughout the Meditations is Marcus's commitment to rigorous self-analysis and continuous questioning of his own motives and actions, combined with strict adherence to ethical principles and maintaining focus despite the countless distractions that accompanied his position as emperor. Another recurring theme involves the promotion of rational thinking as the means to achieve harmony with the logos or divine order that governs the universe, and the importance of treating both triumph and disaster as neither inherently good nor bad in themselves, but simply as natural events to be accepted with equanimity. In 175 AD, the Sarmatian campaign continued as Marcus pursued his ambitious goal of establishing the territories of the Marcomanni Quadi, and Sarmatians as new Roman provinces beyond the Danube, permanently securing the empire's northern frontiers and ending the cycle of tribal incursions. However, it was at this crucial moment that Marcus faced the greatest internal threat of his entire reign when Avidius Cassius, his trusted commander in the eastern provinces, declared himself emperor in opposition to Marcus's rule. There remains some historical speculation that Cassius believed Marcus had died, though this possibility has never been conclusively proven and may simply have provided a convenient justification for his treasonous actions. Rumors also circulated suggesting that Marcus's wife Faustina was involved in this conspiracy, though again, no reliable evidence supports these accusations. Cassius was initially recognized as emperor by the city of Oxyrhynchos in Egypt, which was strategically significant since Egypt served as the breadbasket of the entire empire and represented one of Rome's most economically important provinces. Augustus had previously decreed that senators required special imperial permission even to enter Egypt, recognizing its crucial importance to Roman food security. Support for Cassius in this vital province could have posed a serious threat to Marcus's position and the stability of the empire. The Senate immediately declared Cassius a public enemy, which prompted fears that he might launch an invasion of Italy to seek revenge for this condemnation. Marcus took precautionary measures by dispatching military forces to protect Rome and summoned Commodus, who had returned to the capital partway through the Danube campaign, to ensure the safety of the imperial family and maintain control of the capital. Marcus successfully retained the loyalty of his armies by emphasizing the virtues of faithfulness and honor to his soldiers. He also took advantage of this crisis to have Commodus formally elevated to the position of Princeps Iuventutis, officially confirming him as heir to the imperial throne. Marcus began preparations for a march to the eastern provinces to confront the rebellion, but Cassius's time as a usurper proved remarkably brief. After only 3 months as a self-proclaimed emperor, he was killed by one of his own soldiers, ending the immediate threat to Marcus's authority. Despite the elimination of the military threat, Marcus still felt that his personal presence in the eastern provinces was necessary to restore complete stability and order. He hurriedly concluded a peace agreement with the Jazyges without consulting the Senate, and as part of these arrangements, he sent 5,500 Sarmatian cavalry to serve in Britain, demonstrating his continued strategic thinking even during this political crisis. The imperial party set out for the eastern provinces, and it was during this journey, while traveling through Cappadocia, that Marcus suffered another devastating personal loss when his beloved wife Faustina died unexpectedly. Despite his philosophical training in accepting grief and loss with stoic composure, Marcus was profoundly distressed by Faustina's death. In honor of her memory, he renamed the village where she died as Faustinopolis, ensuring that her name would be permanently preserved in the geographical landscape. Faustina was subsequently deified by the Senate, which may have helped protect her reputation against the various stories and accusations that had circulated about her during her lifetime, including allegations of multiple extramarital affairs that were probably motivated more by political malice than factual evidence. Marcus eventually arrived in Egypt, though the exact date is not recorded in the surviving sources. True to his characteristic clemency and mercy, he dealt moderately with those who had supported Cassius's rebellion, allowing the usurper's surviving son to accept exile rather than facing execution. He pronounced the same merciful punishment on the prefect Calvisius Stationus, who had likely supported Cassius with little genuine choice given the circumstances in Egypt during the rebellion. Marcus also treated the city of Alexandria with remarkable leniency, despite the fact that it had been firmly behind Cassius's bid for imperial power. After successfully resolving the situation in Egypt, Marcus continued his tour of the eastern provinces, making an important stop in Athens, where both he and Commodus were initiated into the mystery cults of Demeter and Persephone, participating in ancient religious rites that connected them to Greek spiritual traditions. The imperial party returned to Rome late in 176 AD, where Marcus granted his son full imperium, allowing Commodus to participate in the upcoming triumph as a partner in imperial authority. Marcus also arranged for Commodus to be exempted from the traditional lex annualis's age requirements, enabling him to hold the consulship in 177 AD at the remarkably young age of 15, making him the youngest consul in Roman history up to that time, perhaps recognizing an opportunity presented by his new availability. Sionia Fabia, Marcus's former betrothed from his youth, offered herself in marriage to the widowed emperor. Marcus politely declined this proposal, but did take a mistress during this period, despite the philosophical reservations he had expressed about his grandfather's similar relationship in his meditations. Soon after his return to Rome, Marcus fell ill once again, receiving treatment from the physician Galen. However, this episode did not appear to be a serious medical crisis, as Galen diagnosed the problem as simply a stomach upset rather than a recurrence of his previous chronic condition. Marcus recovered sufficiently to participate in his triumph ceremony in December 176 AD, celebrating his victories over the Germanic tribes and the successful resolution of the Eastern Rebellion. Unfortunately, his triumphal arch, which was commissioned by the Senate to commemorate these achievements, has not survived to the present day. After Commodus assumed the consulship later, in 177 AD, he was granted the name Augustus and became co-ruler with his father, following the precedent that Marcus himself had established with Lucius Verus earlier in his reign. Although fighting continued along the northern frontiers during 177 AD, Marcus remained in Rome to focus on his judicial and administrative responsibilities, demonstrating his continued commitment to the domestic governance of the empire. Among his various reforms and legal initiatives, Marcus spent considerable time reforming laws related to slavery and the provision of gladiatorial games, seeking to relieve the financial burden on the upper classes who were traditionally required to fund these expensive entertainments. Since many trained gladiators had been recruited into the army for the northern campaigns. Those who remained commanded extremely high prices due to their scarcity. To address the prohibitive cost of organizing these spectacles, Marcus allowed the use of condemned criminals as gladiators in provincial amphitheaters, providing a more economical alternative for local officials. It was also during 177 AD that the persecution of Christians resulted in the famous Martyrs of Lyon, where accused Christians were sent to the arena for execution through trial by ordeal. One of the accused was a Roman citizen, who was held separately until the emperor could decide the appropriate fate for citizens found guilty of practicing Christianity. Marcus appears to have followed established legal precedent that Christians who recanted their faith would be released, while those who refused to abandon their beliefs would face execution as required by law. Since Christianity was considered a capital crime under Roman law, Roman citizens who persisted in their Christian faith were beheaded rather than subjected to the more brutal forms of execution reserved for non-citizens. The bodies of executed Christians were denied burial, which was an important aspect of their religious beliefs, and were subsequently burned to prevent secret burial by their fellow believers. Some historians have suggested that this persecution may have resulted from manipulation of Marcus's gladiatorial reforms. Though this theory cannot be conclusively proven from the available evidence, Marcus also had to address other troubles. Beyond the northern frontiers during this period, the Moors, despite having been defeated earlier in his reign, had once again invaded the Iberian Peninsula, requiring military intervention to protect Roman territories and interests. Additionally, another natural disaster occurred when an earthquake devastated the city of Smyrna in Asia Minor, with the empire's finances recovering from the earlier crises. Marcus was able to provide substantial assistance to help rebuild the damaged city. However, the situation along the northern frontiers remained the primary cause for concern, and Marcus decided to undertake another campaign in that region. This time taking Commodus with him to provide the young emperor with essential military experience. After arranging for the marriage of Commodus to Brucia Crispina to secure the dynastic succession, Marcus and his son departed from Rome in August 178 AD for what would prove to be the emperor's final military campaign. Significant progress was made against the Quadi and Marcomanni during 179 AD, with Roman soldiers establishing garrisons in parts of their territory and maintaining continuous pressure that eventually forced the Quadi to retreat northward. However, they were prevented from crossing into Semnone territory, leaving them trapped between Roman forces and hostile neighbors. The imperial party established winter quarters along the frontier in preparation for resuming the campaign. When the weather improved, but as the 180 AD campaign season was about to begin in March, Marcus suddenly fell seriously ill and died 7 days later on March 17, 180 AD, at the age of 58. He died most likely near Sirmium, though the exact location remains uncertain. Some historians have speculated that he may have died from plague, which was still present in the region, but his precise cause of death remains unknown to modern medical understanding. Marcus Aurelius has been recognized by historians as the last of the 5 good emperors for his just and fair rule during one of the most challenging periods in Roman history. Despite his initial reluctance to assume the imperial throne, having been thoroughly prepared for this role throughout his life, his sense of duty and philosophical commitment to public service ultimately prevailed. Marcus accomplished much during his reign in terms of legal and administrative reform, enacting new legislation that benefited many segments of the population, including enslaved persons, and proving generous in helping communities that suffered from the numerous natural disasters that occurred during his time as emperor. He demonstrated remarkable humility in his dealings with the Senate, showing a level of respect and deference that few of his predecessors had maintained. Despite his lack of practical military experience when he became emperor, Marcus allowed himself to be advised by experienced commanders in matters of war and strategy. Although he harbored expansionist ideals, toward the end of his reign that ultimately went unrealized due to his death. Marcus's military service was primarily defensive in nature, focused on protecting the empire rather than conquering new territories. He was notably merciful toward his enemies, preferring exile to execution when dealing with defeated opponents. And Marcus was equally willing to employ diplomacy and negotiation, as he was to use military force when circumstances required it. Perhaps most importantly, although Marcus did not begin writing his meditations until the final decade of his life and never intended them for publication, these philosophical reflections provide us with an extraordinary glimpse into the mind of an emperor grappling with the enormous challenges of absolute power. While Marcus did not openly declare himself a Stoic philosopher, he embodied many Stoic ideals through his daily actions and maintained exemplary moral standards throughout his reign. The Meditations are widely regarded as one of the most important and influential philosophical works in human history. The complexity and intellectual sophistication evident in the Meditations demonstrate that Marcus Aurelius possessed immense intelligence and wisdom, qualities that explain both his success as an emperor and his enduring reputation. Among subsequent generations, Marcus cannot be characterized as cruel or tyrannical in the manner of some of his predecessors. Yet the persecution of Christians continued during his reign, although these persecutions were not directly ordered or sanctioned by Marcus personally. He made no effort to prevent them either, maintaining existing legal precedents that classified Christianity as a capital crime without seeking to reform these laws. Marcus's death ultimately marked the end of the Pax Romana and the conclusion of Rome's golden age of peace and prosperity. Subsequent emperors, despite some sincere efforts, would fail to maintain the high standards of governance and moral leadership that Marcus had established, including his own son and successor, Commodus. The legacy of Marcus Aurelius endures not only through his political and military achievements, but primarily through his philosophical writings, which continued to inspire readers nearly two millennia after his death. His Meditations offered timeless wisdom about duty, acceptance, mortality, and finding meaning in an often difficult and challenging world. One of his most frequently quoted reflections perfectly captures his approach to life's inevitable difficulties. If thou art pained by any external thing, it is not this that disturbs thee, but thy own judgment about it, and it is in thy power to wipe out this judgment now. Marcus Aurelius successfully embodied the classical ideal of the philosopher-king, demonstrating that political power could be wielded with wisdom, restraint, and genuine concern for the common good. His example continues to inspire leaders and ordinary citizens alike, proving that philosophical reflection and practical action can work together to create a meaningful life dedicated to service and virtue.